Hello, 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 folks. How are we doing today? I hope everyone is having a good Sunday so far. If you are affected by the time change, I hope it didn't catch you out too much. Hey, Soggy, Luis, Solnix. Yeah, I got caught out by the time change. I'm not gonna lie. I forgot about it, and all of a sudden I looked at my clock around 11, and I was like, wait, why does my phone say 12? And yeah, completely spaced that we spring forward today in my time zone. We says same here. Yep. Gosh, I just love daylight savings time, arbitrarily skipping forward and back on the clock for no particular reason. It's just the best thing ever. Hey, no caffeine. That's awesome. Yeah. No, this should be fun today. Very low key, low stress, chilling with some documentation. You gotta love it. I just realized it when the kitchen clock was off. Yeah, actually, same here. I was like, why does my phone not match my stove clock? And yep, something says, why can't we just maximize light during the day all year? Who cares about having the sun at 5 a.m.? I know it's one of those things that just seems so, I don't know, archaic. Um, Epidemi says, hey, hey, Mayan. Hey, Epidemi. Alex says, new beta docs are nice. Yeah, and Alex is referring there to the React beta docs, which is what we are going to be reviewing today. Looking forward to it. Hey, and welcome to the stream, Cactus. All right. Hi, everybody. Cactus says daylight saving times, the day that everybody who involves times in their code projects crosses their fingers and hopes it doesn't break. Yeah, exactly. I don't know, man. Like, daylight savings time, it just seems like a recipe for disaster in so many ways. Don't they say that like more people have like medical emergencies, like when we have the shift of daylight savings time? Like people just like older folks, especially, like they just can't handle it. Yeah, I mean, I work remotely, so it's not a big deal for me anymore. But when I used to have to go into the office every day, I am not a morning person, and that spring forward just it was rough, man. But at least now I work remote and it makes it a little easier. But still, not cool. Hey, Engram, how are ya? Hey, Yakumo. All right, folks. So today, what we're going to be looking at is React. And so we've actually used React previously here on stream on a few different projects. We've used it for a couple things that we've done, and we've also built an app with chat. We had Chat GPT write us some React code as well. So we've definitely used it in projects. However, what I wanted to do today was take a little bit of a step back and kind of just go through the documentation and learn about okay, what makes React tick, what are the rules, because you can definitely use React without understanding everything about it. And that's one of my favorite things to do is to pick up a new skill. I will just say, all right, here's a thing I want to build, and I'm just gonna throw myself at it head first and see if I can apply all this stuff, without really understanding it. And I mean, that's how I like to learn. But I think it is valuable to go back and kind of understand the rules and maybe start from the ground up, especially with something like React, which is very powerful, but definitely has some quirks if all you're familiar with is plain JavaScript. So that's what we're going to do today. And I also have heard from folks like that are like, oh, I want to learn React, but I don't really know where to start. It seems complicated. And so I just thought it would be valuable if we just kind of go through the documentation together. And particularly, we've actually gone through the React documentation on stream before, but that was the quote unquote old documentation, which was not bad, but it used the older class base syntax for React. Which is how React started out. But now there is a new syntax for React, which involves what we call hooks. And I find it much more intuitive and easier to follow and easier to use. And so there's new docs out there, all new, all different. These new docs use the new hooks syntax, and what I really like is they have at the end of each sort of chapter they have challenges, so you can test what you have learned via interactive challenges, and you can run interactive code in the docs themselves, so you don't have to go over to VS Code and mess with stuff. It's all right there in the docs, and I think it's really I think it's really well done, and I think it's worth sort of reviewing together. Excuse me. Hey, Mavi. Hey, Sonari. Hey, Matt. Mavi says, I've been through the beta docs. I have notes times 300. Yeah, yeah. They are quite good. And I know that some folks here on stream might be very familiar with React, and you may have already gone through the docs. My goal here today is to kind of hopefully bring in some folks that haven't seen the docs and, kind of just maybe never even seen React, and just kind of build from scratch here. But if you are familiar with React, you please do, hang around and, contribute. Maybe there'll be something we don't understand and they all can shed a light. I love it when folks in chat are able to provide additional context or, explain things in a different way if it's not making sense. So that's awesome. Hey, Burrito. Burrito Array. I love that name. That's fantastic. Hey, Priscilla. Yeah, and we are not going to get through the whole docs today. I can tell you that outright. That's not going to happen. We're not going to be rushing through this. We're going to be taking our time. We're going to be lingering on things. Thank you for the follow there, Diva. I appreciate it. We're going to be just taking whatever time we need, and this is probably going to be the start of a multi-part series, where eventually we'll get through the whole doc, but not in one sitting, certainly. I don't do 12-hour streams anymore. It's not healthy. Hey, Priscilla. I learned React in Udemy since January, but still not confident to build my own website. Good to have this today. Yeah, that's great. I don't know the Udemy course that you took. I don't know maybe if they use hooks or class-based React, but hopefully, the newer syntax of React will be easier for you to pick up. Solnik says, "Oh man, I had a 12-hour session blocked out to cover this. Nah, go do something healthy with your life after 3 hours." Oh, thank you, Obi. All right. Yeah, and also, yeah, we're probably only going to go about, if for those of you who are planning out your time, we're probably only going to go about 3 hours today. That's healthier for my voice, and it's healthier for you to go, do other things with your day. Also, I need a few hours after the stream to emotionally prepare myself for the finale of The Last of Us later on this evening. So, you gotta plan out some prep time for that. So no spoilers in chat, please. I already know the end, but I'm sure there's folks here that don't. So no spoilers. But yeah, gotta prioritize. Currently learning Next.js. Yeah, Next.js is a great sort of continuation of React. Yeah. Hey, Alex. All right, so let's get into it. So first off, what is React? So what I'm looking at right here is the reactjs.org website, which is quite good. So I'll paste that in chat. There you go. There's a link to it if you want to go. And React is a JavaScript library for building user interfaces, just like it says on the tin, right? So why do we care, right? We all know that we can build, well, that most of us here anyway, know that we can build apps using our good friends JavaScript, HTML, and CSS. And those are perfectly fine. You are perfectly allowed and able to build apps in JS, HTML, CSS, and your favorite template engine, Tailwind, you can use Bootstrap, whatever. But what's nice about React is that it allows you to make UIs that are more interactive. And you can separate out your UI into individual components, which can be which can sort of exist independently of each other, but can be managed by central logic. So, for example, let's say that you had a very large web page with a lot of content on it, like a bunch of images, a bunch of bunch of little sort of text sections and everything. And then in one small area, you had a little form, and you wanted the user to submit that form and still stay on the page. Well, it would really suck if every time the user submitted an answer to a question, say on the form, you had to reload the entire page to display the updated information. Let's say it's like a to-do list, right? And you have this whole page with a bunch of content on it, and you just have this one little list, and the user enters something, they hit submit, and the item shows up on the list. Well, if you had to reload the page, the entire page with all of that content, every single time somebody added something to that list, that would suck, right? Like, and it's gonna cause the user to notice a disruption, right? Page is gonna reload. It might take a while for images to populate and all that stuff. um, and it's not you're not being smart with your resources, right? You're using bandwidth, you're using time, all these things. It's not smart. But with React, what you could do is have that little to-do list section be its own individual component, and it would be the only thing that refreshes on the page when you add an item. Everything else stays static. So that's one of the things about React. It makes it painless to create interactive UIs. Design simple views for each state in your application, and React will efficiently update and render just the right components when your data changes. So only the things that need to change will change on the page. Um, Declarative views make your code more predictable and easier to debug. And so, we kind of talked about components. So what you can do is build encapsulated components that manage their own state. So these components keep track of what's inside of them, and then you can assemble those individual components and reuse components as well. So you could have a say like a header component, and you could reuse that component on multiple pages, right, over and over and over again, so you don't have to code the same thing more than once. And since component logic is written in JavaScript instead of templates, you can easily patch rich data through your app and keep state out of the DOM. So yeah, you're going to be in. The nice thing is you'll be writing in JavaScript. You can have logic. You're doing all the logic and stuff behind the scenes, and then by the time it gets to the DOM, it's fully fledged and ready to display. And there's this other thing here: learn once, write anywhere. So you might have heard of something like React Native. You can develop mobile apps. You can it's very versatile. You can use it in multiple places. Yeah, absolutely. And it's fun. React is really fun to just build stuff with. It's very fluid. It kind of just takes away some of the clumsiness of writing things in plain JavaScript and HTML, CSS. And it's very compatible with a lot of other tools and features. So we looked at the last in my last stream, we looked at Vite, right, which is a bundler, which allows you to quickly create and deploy things to production. We didn't use React with Vite, but that was one of the options there. Is that you can build something, create a React app in Vite, and then quickly deploy to production. All right, so that's what React is for. And right here on the homepage, they do say, get started, take the tutorial, but we're not going to do these. If you want to learn the class-based version of React, this is what you would use. This is you would use these links here, and we've covered them on stream. So if you want to go through them with me, you can hit up my YouTube channel, !YouTube, and we have already gone through this documentation on stream previously. However, today we are going to go to the beta docs, and these use the newer ways of writing React. And I already have them open here, but you can click this link and go to the beta docs, and this will take us to the new version. So what we have here in the React docs are essentially, we have instructions for installation. You have quick start, which is kind of like a crash course for React. So it goes through all the concepts in the larger documentation, except in a very abbreviated, condensed form. So if you're already familiar with React, you might just visit this and kind of zoom through it and make sure that you understand all the concepts. But today we're going to be going through these sections here, which are a little bit more in depth and kind of starting from zero. Hey, legendary grandmaster, welcome to the stream. And then also you can also see a reference for API usage. Um, but today we're going to be focusing on just this Learn React section here. And they will be deploying these docs to the main site very soon. It looks like they're 99% done. I think it's been that way for a while. I'm not sure when they're planning to actually deploy these, but these documents are essentially fully finished and ready to go. So any questions before we get started? And also feel free, if you're new to the stream today, feel free to ask questions anytime. There's no specific, set time when you're allowed to ask questions or anything like that. We're always happy to take a pause and answer questions. Hey, no worries, Gargoyle. Happy to go through the docs. What is required? Nothing at all. It's great if you want to follow along in your own browser. I'm going to paste the link. The link is in chat there. You'll find that there are anything that's interactive. There's interactive challenges and that sort of thing. Those things are actually embedded in the docs themselves. So any links, any code that you will need is already in the docs themselves, and you can edit it in the docs, which I think is pretty cool. You don't need any special tools or anything like that. If you want to, actually build apps in React and following these installation instructions to build your own stuff, you can, you would need VS Code and Node in order to do that. But today we're not going to be doing that. We're just going to be following what's in the docs here. All right. And the last thing before we get started, I wanted to show, do we need Node.js on our local? For what we're going to be going over today on stream, no. Everything is in the browser, I promise. In the docs themselves, there are little sandboxes, kind of like like a browser sandbox, and you don't need anything installed locally. However, if you want to build your own apps on your own time, then yeah, you will need Node locally, but not for what we're going over today on stream. So don't stress, you don't got to go install anything or anything like that. Everything is in the docs themselves. Legendary says, can I use React with Java Spring Framework? I would suggest checking out the React docs site that we're on, particularly reactjs.org, and see what their compatibility is. I don't know for sure, but I'm sure it's listed in the docs. MK says, hey, Mine, do you plan on doing React projects with MySQL DB apps? Eventually, yeah. I would like to do some more stuff with SQL backends. Yeah, there's all sorts of possibilities. But yeah, I would like to do more stuff with SQL backends versus what we've done in the past, which is mostly no SQL. Lucian says, what is required from a knowledge standpoint? Like, should we know some JavaScript before? Yes, it's going to help if you know basic JavaScript and you know basically sort of the rules of how to read and write JavaScript. If you don't, there's no harm in kind of just following along today, but you might not fully understand some of the logic and you might miss out on some of the context if you don't already know JavaScript. However, nothing to prevent you from just sitting in watching along today. Mommy says, I vote to do app with microservices architecture, but only because it's funny. We're just going to keep building more and more elaborate, unnecessary to do apps, aren't we? Let's just get nuts with it. All right. So before we get started, I do want to show you all something. So if you've been through 100 devs, one of the first projects that we are assigned to do in 100 devs is building out or mimicking the HTML and CSS of the Khan Academy website. So Khan Academy is just it's a educational website, right? But it doesn't really matter what the content is. One of the assignments was to build out the HTML. And what you might not know is that this website actually is not built with HTML. It's built with React. And so if I look at my React Dev tools here, it actually says this page is using the production build of React. And so later on, when we get over to when we start learning about components and nesting components and things like that, we'll take another look at this, and we'll take a look at the actual components, the React components that truly are the backbone of this Khan Academy site that so many of us slaved over the HTML on. So I just thought that was funny. Skid says, 100 devs catch up crew. Whoop whoop. Yes, we love the catch up crew. Beast says, that brings back memories. I can't believe it's been a year. Yeah, it kind of tells us how far we've come, right? From struggling with the HTML on the Khan Academy site to actually now reviewing what truly makes it tick, which is React. So Lexic says, please, are you going to put the video on YouTube? Yes, I will. I usually don't do it right away. You can watch this recording on Twitch after, immediately after it's done. It'll be available on Twitch. And then usually after a couple weeks, I'll move it over to YouTube. So exclamation point YouTube if you want to link to my channel where you can see all my past streams. And Pistol Peter says, I was stressed working on that site. I think we all were. All right, let's get into it. So we are going to start in the Learn React section and the Describing the UI section. CSS is still hard a year later. Oh yeah, that's why we have tools that make it a little easier, such as Bootstrap and all those libraries that we can use. All right, so the first section here is describing the UI, and React is a JavaScript library for rendering user interfaces, or UI. UI is built from small units like buttons, text, and images. React lets you combine them into reusable, nestable components. From websites to phone apps, everything on the screen can be broken down into components. In this chapter, you'll learn to create, customize, and conditionally display React components. So that's probably the most important concept about React is it's all about breaking things down into individual components that make sense. And those components can work together, but they should also be able to function completely independently as their own units on the page. They might react to the same changes. So you might have two components that react at the same time, but they don't have to communicate with each other. So we'll talk more about that when we get into like state and that kind of thing. But that's the most important thing to remember about React is that its main advantage is that you can break things down into individual components that do not have to rely on anything else on the page in order to work. Hey Hassan, how's it going? All right, so let's go to your first component. So the rest of what's on this page is really just a summary of the types of things we're going to be talking about in this chapter. So let's go ahead and go into the first section, which is your first component. So components are one of the core concepts of React. They are the foundation upon which you build user interfaces, which makes them the perfect place to start your journey. So in this chapter, we're going to learn what a component is, what role components play in a React application, and how to write your first React component. So components, like we talked about, components are UI building blocks. So we already know that you can use HTML to create rich structured documents with built-in tags. So here we have article tags, and inside of that article, we have an H1, and then we have an ordered list and the individual line items in the list itself. So the markup represents the article tag, its heading, and an abbreviated table of contents as an ordered list. Markup like this, combined with CSS for style and JavaScript for interactivity, lies behind every sidebar, avatar, modal, dropdown, every piece of UI that you see on the web. React lets you combine your markup, CSS, and JavaScript into custom components, which are reusable UI elements for your app. The table of contents code you saw above could be turned into a table of contents component you could render on every page. So we could make this into something rather than a set of individual tags, which we put together in a certain order. We could turn it into a custom component, which becomes this, that we could reuse as many times as we want, and it would make the same thing happen every time. Under the hood, it still uses the same HTML tags like article H1, etc. We're just packaging it together. Just like with HTML tags, you can compose, order, and nest components to design whole pages. For example, the documentation page you're reading is made out of React components. Yeah. And so what we're seeing here on this page is the page layout, a header, navigation header, some links, a sidebar, which is what's on the left here, page content, table of contents, documentation text. And so essentially, that's all of the things that we see on the page. Third Decade says, do you want to mix JavaScript and React functionalities? So I'm not quite sure. I want to make sure I understand what you're asking, but essentially that's what React does. Is React allows you, and we'll see this very soon. What React allows you to do is it's sort of like you are empowering your HTML with the ability to do JavaScript logic. That's a very crude explanation, but essentially you are writing what you're going to be writing what in what you call JSX, which allows you to use logic to conditionally render certain HTML tags in the DOM. And so you won't be writing in like JavaScript plus HTML. You're going to be writing in something called JSX, which then renders out to HTML in the browser. So don't worry, it'll make more sense as we go. But that is kind of what we're doing. Is we are turning everything into a logical language, which then renders out to HTML in the browser. And they mention here, they say, as your project goes, you will notice that many of your designs can be composed by reusing components that you already wrote, speeding up your development. Our table of contents above could be added to any screen that requires a table of contents. You can even jumpstart your project with the thousands of components shared by the React open source community, like Chakra UI and Material UI. You may have heard of Material UI. And I think, Chakra as well. And so essentially, if you have a library of all these components, you can literally just drop them into your project and pass in the information that you want that component to display. We'll learn how that works a little bit later, but you can pass in that information and have a ready-made component that will, have all the behavior and the look that you need. Yeah, JSX. It's exactly that's what we're going to be using to write React. All right, so defining a component. Traditionally, when creating web pages, web developers marked up their content and then added interaction by sprinkling on some JavaScript, right? So you would write your HTML, and then that would be the backbone of your site, right? Is your HTML, it's the structure. And then you would you would have a separate, JavaScript file for your all your logic, your interactable elements. This worked great when interaction was nice to have on the web. So back in like 1995, when everything was HTML and you could maybe click a few links occasionally or maybe a button, but it wasn't always a given that a website would have any interactivity at all. Sometimes it would just be a wall of text that you would read and then you would go to the next website. However, now interaction is expected for many sites and all apps. React puts interactivity first while still using the same technology. A React component is a JavaScript function that you can sprinkle with markup. So it's kind of the opposite of how the web used to be. Now the primary focus is interactivity, and then we're sprinkling markup on top of it to make it to give the user something to interact with. So here's what that looks like. All right, so what we have here is essentially a function, export default function profile, and what that returns is an image, right, with a URL and an alt tag. So we have what looks like a JavaScript function here, and what we're returning is an image tag. Interesting. Okay. Sorry, I'm missing some chat here. Let me catch up real quick. Solnick says, I'm still pretty new to React, but how does React integrate with a static web page? For example, if I have a web page that only needs one or two reusable components, how can I integrate those components into a static HTML page? Yeah, so that's a great question. The React docs actually have instructions on how to help you do that. Because that's a very common thing, right? You might have a page that's mostly static, but you want like one or two interactable elements, and you don't want to rewrite your whole thing in JSX. Um, and so the React docs actually have some pretty good tips on how to add a few interactive components to your already pre-existing, static site. And so I would highly suggest taking a look at those. Sullivan says, what's the link to the doc? We are right here. Third Decade says, I think I meant, doesn't JavaScript already provide interactivity on the UI? So if you think about how you write apps currently with vanilla JavaScript, everything starts with an HTML page, right? You can embed like scripts in your HTML, but it's kind of janky. And generally, what happens is somebody maybe interacts with a button or clicks a link, and then that travels to a separate, main.js or whatever, and then something has to happen, and then it comes back to the UI, and you probably have to reload the page if you want something to change. And your whole page has to refresh. And maybe there's sometimes you have to have logic in controllers on the back end, and so you have kind of a separation of display and logic when you're looking at just plain HTML and CSS, because the web started out as HTML, which doesn't really allow for interactivity or extra logic that isn't already embedded in tags. And but what React allows you to do is to have that logic be the base of everything that you're doing, and then you sprinkle markup on top to make it that logic have interaction, and then it all renders out to HTML in the DOM. Rex says, insane how vast the JavaScript environment is. I haven't even started learning vanilla JavaScript. That's okay. Yeah, this you will be able to follow along better if you understand basic JavaScript today. But that doesn't mean you can't sit and listen and pick some stuff up. Yeah, and the main advantage there, Dev, true, is that so the main advantages of React over vanilla JavaScript and HTML are that um, when you make a change to something on the page, part of the UI, you don't have to refresh the whole page every time something changes. You can refresh individual components on the page, but think about, like we said earlier, if you have a small part of the page that is being changed, you don't necessarily want to refresh the entire page. Like if a blog updates or something like that, and you have 100, you have one of those endless scroll type pages, um, you don't want the whole page to update. Or think about a chat bot, right? Think about a web page with a chat function inside of it. Every time somebody sent a message to you, if that whole page had to update, that would fricking suck, right? You don't want that. You don't want the whole page updating every time somebody sends you a chat message. That would be like a strobe light. And so what React allows you to do is separate out those components and only specifically render what needs to render at a given time. Thank you for the follow there, Lucas. So I think, yeah, my best example of that is probably a page with a chat function inside of it. And what you will see is on those pages with a chat function, with a chat box in them, if you look, you'll find that they're running on React. And you may not need React for every project. It may not be necessary. Some projects are going to do just fine with all the static HTML, CSS, JS. So don't think that you have to learn React, but do know that it can be extremely useful as your projects and your web pages and your apps get more and more complex. All right. So we saw this is an example of a React component. We are exporting it here, and what we're returning is an image tag. So what's happening? How do we build a component? First, we need to export the component. So the export default prefix is a standard JavaScript syntax. It's not specific to React. It lets you mark the main function in a file so that you can later import it from other files. So, and you may have seen this before. For example, when you're defining like a mongoose schema, right? A lot of the times, if you're setting up a mongoose schema, you'll have that schema in its own file. So, because you don't want it might be super long and you don't want it cluttering up your controllers or your server or whatever. And so you put that schema in its own file and you only import it when you need it. And so that's literally how React works, is you can have your components in separate files so they're easy to access and very organized. And so your code becomes much less cluttered. So you have those in a file, you export them, and then you import them whenever you need them. All right, so first you set up your export, and then we define the function. So you're simply defining a JavaScript function with the name profile. Now, they have a little pitfall marked here. It says React components are regular JavaScript functions, but their names must start with a capital letter or they won't work. That's how you define a a React component separate from a JavaScript function. You know that when we write functions in JavaScript, we normally use CamelCase. And so by CamelCase, what I mean is that if we have multiple words, the first letter will be lowercase and the second letter will be uppercase. However, with React, you're going to start your component names with a capital letter. So the next step, first you export, define the function, and then we add our markup. So the component above returns an image tag with source and alt attributes. Image is written like HTML, but it is actually JavaScript under the hood. This syntax is called JSX, and it lets you embed markup inside JavaScript. So when we're returning what looks to us like an image tag, JSX it's just a what do we call it? It's syntactical sugar, right? It looks good to the humans, but underneath the code is going to interpret it differently, and eventually it will render out as an image tag in the browser. But just know that this is not actually HTML. This is JSX, but it is written in a familiar style that we are familiar with to look like HTML. So when we write a return statement to return some what looks to us like HTML tags, we can return everything on one line. But if your markup isn't all on the same line as the return keyword, you must wrap it in a pair of parentheses like this. So here we have a div which contains an image tag. And since this is multiple lines, all we need to do is add parentheses, and that will return the whole thing as a chunk of tags. Without parentheses, any code on the lines after return will be ignored. Yeah, and you catch we'll get into that a little bit later, but that's a good point. So what you'll find, what sort of reminds you that you're not actually writing HTML, some unholy hybrid of HTML and JavaScript, is that you'll find that there are some attributes, familiar attributes on HTML tags that aren't written quite the same as they would be if you were writing plain HTML. We'll see a little bit about that later, but yep, good thing to remember. Reserved JS words be like that. Yeah, absolutely. So how do we use a component? Okay, that's all well and good, right? We can write a freaking component, but how do we use it? Now that you've defined your profile component, you can nest it inside other components. For example, you can export a gallery component that uses multiple profile components. So this is what brings in some of what makes React unique. So up above, we wrote that profile component, and it is now contained inside of a profile tag. So right here it is. So we have our profile function. It returns an image tag, which contains this stuff. And now that we have that, we can use it as many times as we want. We can call on it as many times as we want to populate our gallery, right? And so I'm calling it 3 times here, and it's very compact. We can just say the name of it, the name of our component, and we can call it as many times as we want, and it will render 3 times. And so you can kind of see why reusable components might be useful, right? So thinking about things like headers, footers, sidebars, um, all those things that just repeat over and over and over again. Or gallery, think like this is a gallery tile, right? So you might have an image gallery and you want to display a bunch of images all with the same style and behavior and logic potentially. Instead of having to repeat that logic over and over again, or loop or something like that, you can simply call the same component as many times as you need. Um, and what we'll see later is that it's also possible to pass different what we I guess we would call kind of arguments. If we were thinking about a function, you can pass different arguments into a component to make it have a different outcome with the same basic logic, right? So if I wanted a different picture of a different person in each tile of this gallery, I could pass in, the person that I want to display into each of these components separately, and they would all render with the same size, spacing, behavior, all that sort of thing, but just the different person inside of them. Crytek says, is HTML treating components simply as elements? So what's important to remember here is that JSX, which is this sort of the language that React uses, JSX is handling all of that. By the time it gets to the DOM just reads it as HTML. The HTML doesn't do any of the thinking. JSX takes in what we give it. So it takes in, all of this information. We're returning a section, H1, 3 calls to this profile component. JSX processes all of that and renders it out to the DOM as plain old vanilla HTML. And so once we get through this section, I think let's go back and take another look at the Khan Academy homepage, and I'll show you what I mean. What you'll see is that the Khan Academy homepage has what looks like plain HTML in the DOM, like you're used to seeing, right? Everybody knows how to look at HTML using the inspector. You can see what HTML is there, but when we really look under the hood, you'll see it's just React components all the way down, which are rendering out to the DOM as HTML. And Jamtime says, like, we could dynamically set the image source. Yeah, we could, and we'll see that later on. So that's called passing props. You don't have to know that just yet. We're going to get to it later, never fear. But yeah, that's one of one of the powerhouses of React is that you can reuse this component over and over again, but you can change things, for example, like the image source that you pass into it, just like you could with a regular JavaScript function. You can pass in different arguments to prompt different output behavior. Thank you for the follow, Sid. MME says, can we use logic like a for loop to reuse components multiple times in the return? Yeah, we will see. And that's another powerful thing about React is that you can use all of the logic that you're familiar with in JavaScript, such as map, for each, all of that very familiar, lovely, iterative logic that you would normally use in JavaScript. You can use that in React to cause component behavior, like rendering out list items or rendering a gallery X number of times. We will see that later on. There's actually sections here later on for conditional rendering, rendering lists, all that sort of thing. So yeah, it's absolutely possible to do that, and something you should do. Lucas says, "What a great stream! Your content is awesome." Oh, thank you, Lucas. I appreciate it. I'm glad you're here. Yep. All right. So this is an example of reusing a component. And right now these components are all displaying the same, right? Because we're not passing in anything to change their behavior. We've set them up as just an image tag with, hard-coded values. So they're going to render the same each time. However, it is reusable. So what does the browser see? Well, notice the difference in casing. So our section tag is lowercase. So React knows that we are referring to an HTML tag, right? This is the difference. This is the crucial thing. If our tag is lowercase, it's going to be read and rendered as HTML. However, our component, we make that stand out with a capital letter. So React knows that we want to use our component called profile. And then it's going to go and fetch it, and it's going to do all the logic, and then it's going to render out the HTML as needed. And profile contains even more HTML, which is an image tag. So in the end, this is what the browser sees. So if we were to look at this in the DOM, this is what we would see. We would see a section tag with an H1, and then our 3 image tags. So the browser does not see this. It doesn't know what a profile is, right? JSX handles that under the hood and then hands it to the browser and says, hey, bro, I've got 3 image tags for you. So it handles that and renders it out into something that the browser can handle. Mavi says, if there's not a cat picture example, Claire totally dropped the ball. I blame the final episode. Yeah. Yeah, we're going to be using, I do think the docs are pretty cool because it's all examples, like all the example photos are famous scientists, including a lot of, female scientists that haven't necessarily gotten coverage in mainstream. And so I do like what they've done for the examples, but it does need more cats. You're correct, Mavi. Crytek says, so that's why we use capitalization. We use it so it doesn't treat it as HTML, and React can work on it. Yes. And we're going to see an example of that in just a little bit. What happens if you don't do that? If you don't capitalize a React component, what happens? So we'll see that in a little bit. Drunk Uncle Grandma says, God, yeah. Yeah, it's good to get that out of your system occasionally. Absolutely. All right, so nesting and organizing components. Components are regular JavaScript functions, so you can keep multiple components in the same file, right? Components are functions. That's all, it's not a huge, intellectual leap here to remember. Components are just functions. They aren't anything special. It's just like you always write JavaScript functions. That's a component in React. And so just like with JavaScript, you can keep multiple components in one file. This is convenient when components are relatively small or closely related to each other. If this file gets crowded, you can always move a component to a separate file. You'll learn how to do this shortly on the page about imports. Yeah, and that's what you'll see a lot of the time in a React project, is what you'll see is you'll have a folder structure of the app where all the components are kind of in their own separate files. And it just keeps things very clean, very organized, and you can always know exactly where to find the component that you need. Because the profile components are rendered inside the gallery, even several times, we can say that gallery is a parent component rendering each profile as a child. This is part of the magic of React. You can define a component once and then use it in as many places or as many times as you like. And we're kind of familiar with the concept of parents and children from working with HTML tags, right? You have a UL tag, which is kind of the parent, and then you have LI tags inside of it, which are children, or nesting divs and stuff like that. You can do the same thing with React components. You can nest them. So when we talk about nesting, though, it's important to remember that when we talk about that, we're talking about when we call the components. So it's okay to nest these calls to the profile component inside of our gallery component, right? That's perfectly fine and valid to do. However, what you don't want to do is nest the definitions of those components. So when we call on profile, it's okay for us to do that inside of our gallery component. But what we don't want to do is define gallery and then define profile inside of that. So components can render other components, but you must never nest their definitions. So that's just the difference. You don't want to nest the definitions of components. What you want to do instead is define every component at the top level. So not nesting them, defining them separately. And then once you've defined them, you can have one component render another after it's already been defined. Balti says, I'm too stupid to code. That is not true, my friend. If you want to truly start coding from scratch and truly take a zero to hero approach, for free. You shouldn't never pay for a boot camp, never pay for anything. Type exclamation point Leon in chat, and you can join the 100 Devs community, which is a community that where people learn to become web developers for free. I swear it's completely free, all free resources, never paying for anything. That's how I learned to do this stuff from scratch without spending any money at all, because spending money for something like this is it's wrong. It's fundamentally morally wrong, and education should be free for everyone. So that's why the 100 Devs community is great, and you should not have to pay to learn to code. Don't get yourself down that Udemy rabbit hole paying $100 per course. You can if you want, but you shouldn't have to. Oh, thank you, Pistol Peter. Yeah, Leon is great. Is really great. All right, so I hope that makes sense. You shouldn't nest function. You shouldn't nest these definitions of components, but they can render each other. So components all the way down. Um, Your React application will begin at a root component. Usually it's created automatically when you start a new project. For example, if you use Code Sandbox or Create React App, the root component is defined in app.js. So if you've ever just done Create React App, in in Node, use the command Create React App, and it generates a React template for you. You'll notice that there is a root inside of your app.js file. So most React apps use components all the way down. That means that you won't only use components for reusable pieces like buttons, but also for larger pieces like sidebars, lists, and ultimately complete pages. Components are a handy way to organize UI code and markup, even if some of them are only used once. We're going to see that in a minute when we look back at the Khan Academy site. Frameworks like Next.js take this a step further. Instead of using an empty HTML file and letting React take over managing the page with JavaScript, they also generate the HTML automatically from your React components. This allows your app to show some content before the JavaScript code loads. Still, and this is what somebody asked earlier, they said, they asked, okay, I have a static site and I want to add just a little bit of React to it. Still, many websites only use React to add sprinkles of interactivity. They have many root components instead of a single one for the entire page. You can use as much or as little React as you need. So if you are wondering, how can I add React to my static site without having to rebuild the whole thing from scratch? You don't have to. I would follow this link and learn how to implement React selectively in certain locations on your site without having to rewrite the whole thing. So click that and check that out yourself. MME says, should each component be in its separate file and be imported when we need it? Or can we define multiple components in one file? Yeah, so like they said earlier, you can define multiple components in one file. If you have a bunch of small components that are very closely related to each other, so maybe they're doing similar things, or they're all members of the same parent component, you can define them in the same file. It's just like you would with JavaScript functions, right? We're allowed to have more than one JavaScript function in the same file, but we do tend to split them out. We do tend to kind of split our code out and break it apart based on things that are logically related to each other. So what you'll see often is that individual components will be in their own file, but you can have multiple components in the same file if they are related to each other. Yeah, Mavi, we will. We'll talk a little bit more about fragments later on. Yeah, we'll talk a little bit about fragments later on, because yes, you are limited on if there's not a need for any. Yeah, so we'll talk about wrapping things up and when to use fragments. Fragments are your friend, absolutely. Yep. Okay, so quick recap. You've just gotten your first taste of React. Let's recap some key points. React lets you create components or reusable UI elements for your app. In a React app, every piece of UI is a component. And React components are regular JavaScript functions, except their names always begin with a capital letter and they return JSX markup instead of, you know, they render out as HTML, but what they return is a markup that looks like HTML and then renders out to HTML in the DOM. So I think we're about ready for a break. And this is actually, the timing is perfect here. But first off, we're going to do a couple challenges. These are, just kind of introductory challenges which cover what we talked about in the chapter so far. So feel free to scroll back up in the chapter and, look up these answers. There's no harm in doing that. Or you can try to remember what we talked about already and see if you can answer these questions. So first challenge, it says this sandbox doesn't work because the root component is not exported. Try to fix it yourself before looking at the solution. So it says we have this profile component right here, and it says element type is invalid, expected a string or a class/function, but got object. You likely forgot to export your component from the file it's defined in, or you might have mixed up the default and name imports. Okay, so based on that information, what do we think we need to do in order to fix this? In order to make it actually display something over here in the window. When we get it working, instead of this error, it's going to actually display the correct component in the window. So what do we need to do? Does anybody know? Feel free to scroll back up if you need to. Matt Wheelahan says, how would CSS work? Select the element classes IDs in the components? Yes, and we'll see how we can incorporate IDs and classes into React components a little bit later. Does anybody know how we could possibly fix this function to make it export correctly? Feel free to drop in chat once you figure it out. Yeah, exactly. Exactly. We actually need to export it. So let's just scroll back up here real quick. And if we recall, this was a little while ago. So the first step in writing a React component is that we need to export it. So that is required for us to make it work. And we can see here in this version of it, export default function profile. So let's go ahead and do that and see if that works. Go back down to the challenges here. Export default. Hey, it works. Yay. Export default function profile. Yeah. Now it's exported. And it's finally able to display. And if let's just go back here, we'll reset it. Yes. I want to see the error again. So if we read the error, it's actually telling us what's wrong, right? It's saying you likely forgot to export your component from the file it's defined in. And that was literally our problem. So the error messages are very descriptive. And if we read the error, it's actually telling us what's wrong. So all we need to do is say export default function. Ta-da! It works. Hooray. All right. And I would highly suggest if you're following along, code along in the docs. Like do these examples, get your hands on your keyboard and write them out. Even if you don't, even if you don't know the answer, once we talk about it, then write out the answer yourself and then look at the solution and see if it matches. Seiwan says export default function, but the React I am dealing with is class components. Yes. So if you're currently working, if you want to learn more about the class-based version of React, I would go back to the reactjs.org site and read through those documents. Those are class-based. So they have both. We're learning the hooks-based version of React today, but if you want to learn class-based, they have a whole nother set of documents that will teach you the class-based version of React as well. All right, next challenge. Challenge 204, fix the return statement. Something isn't right about this return statement. Can you fix it? Okay, so if we look at this, we have our export default. That's correct. We have our profile, and then it's returning, like we saw before, it looks like it's returning an image tag with some alt text. Okay, and the image tag looks good, but we're not getting anything back. So no errors, but the return statement isn't returning what we want it to return. So what's missing? What do we need here that we don't have? Or how can we restructure this to make it behave properly? Yeah, so folks, to stay in the parentheses, absolutely, that's a valid way to do it. Let's do. Get my, fix my, maybe. There we go. Okay, so parentheses worked, but as Sullivan said, the image tag could, another way we could fix it is if you have a one-liner like this, another way we could fix it is if we simply just move the image tag to the same line as the return statement. So there's two ways we could do this, right? We could add parentheses if it's going to be multi-line, or if we just want to, if it's really a really long tag or something like that, and we just want it on its own line, we can use parentheses. Or we can, if it's a single line return such as this, we can simply just move them to the same line, which is what we've done here. Um, either one is valid. I kind of like the parenthesis method. Just, if I want to add more to this later on, if I want to add more to this later on, I like the parentheses instead. I think it's a little cleaner. But either way is valid. It's just important to remember that the return statement won't recognize something that's on a different line unless you add parentheses. All right. So next challenge. Got a couple more and then we'll take a break. So challenge 3 of 4, let's see if we can spot the mistake. So something is wrong with how the profile component is declared and used. Can you spot the mistake? As a hint, try to remember how React distinguishes components from regular HTML tags. All right, so what do we have here? We have our profile component, and then we have our gallery component, which calls the profile component and renders it 3 times. All right, so what is the problem here? Why won't this recognize? It says the tag profile is unrecognized in this browser. Pretty much, and again, once again, the error is telling us exactly what's wrong, right? If you want to render a React component, start its name with an uppercase letter. Yeah, we have to capitalize because it's trying to render it it can't tell that it's a component unless we capitalize it, right? It's going to think it's some kind of HTML tag that it doesn't understand. So now watch as I make these changes. Boop, boop. It's like magic. It suddenly starts working. It suddenly says, oh, that's a component. I know what that is. And it's able to render it for us. Yeah. So we capitalize both the definition and down here when we call it to render it. Okay, last challenge. Your own component. Write a component from scratch. You can give it any valid name and return any markup. If you're out of ideas, you can write a congratulations component that shows good job. Don't forget to export it. All right, so I would highly suggest that you try this on your own, but we'll write one together here. So definitely this, if you can, if you're able to, have these docs open and be coding along if you're able to do so. Or if you're not able to do so while you're watching, you can always go back and do this later. All right, so we're going to do export defaults function. I'm going to call this, we'll do what they say. We'll call it congratulations. I can't spell congratulations, so I'm going to copy and paste because I suck at spelling. All right, and then we'll have it. So now, as you can see, now that I have a valid function structure, it knows what that is, what I'm trying to do there. And we will say return I'm going to have it return this H1. Hooray! Good job, us. Now, again, if I wanted to have this on its own line, I would need to just put parentheses around that return statement. Yeah, and Seiwan says, oh, they deal with functional components, just dealing with arrow functions like const. Yeah, and you can use arrow function syntax when you're writing out React components. That's perfectly valid as well. I think the docs here mostly just use the traditional sort of function definitions, but if you're comfortable with arrow functions, you can use those as well. Third Decade has suggested a poll, so I'll set that poll up during the break, and it'll be running after we get back from the break. But yeah, so here's our component and our return. Now you might say, la-di-da, this is like, why are we bothering with this if it's just going to return static text or static images? And don't worry, as we get down to these two sections down here, we're going to start learning how to include logic, JavaScript functionality, and some more behavior inside of our components. So that is coming. Yeah. All right. So any questions before we go on break? One says, "I thought I'd do class components." No, you'll once you if you look at JavaScript class syntax, it's very it's very different than what we're doing now, and I think a much higher barrier to entry, much harder to learn than using things in a more familiar functional way. Okay, but if anybody thinks of questions, feel free to ask them over the break, and I'll address them when we get back. Otherwise, let's go ahead and do a 5-minute break so we can get up and have a drink of water and stretch and all those things and be healthy. Yeah, and Dev Limiter says functional components are so much easier now with hooks. Absolutely, yeah. Unfortunately, the 100 Devs curriculum covers the class-based React, and I do hope that for the next round we switch to doing the hooks-based React because it's so much easier to pick up. There's a question there. Lubick says, in the spot mistake challenge, why we don't export the profile component? Yeah, so in this case, we are creating it and then immediately calling it in the same location. So we aren't moving things across files. So we don't need to export it here. Yeah. In this case, we're defining this component and then immediately calling it. So we don't need to export it. But generally you will, because you're going to have your components in like their own standalone files, and you're going to be calling them in other places. So most of the times you will be exporting, but not all the time. Where's the poll? Yeah, I'm going to set it. It takes a minute. I can't do it while I'm talking. I'll have to set it up over the break. So don't worry, it'll be here when you get back. All right, let's go ahead and take that break. 5-minute timer. When we come back, we're going to go on to the next section in this chapter, which is we're going to talk more about importing and exporting components. All right. So I'll reset this back to 5. So 5 minutes. When we come back, again, next section in the chapter, and we'll also have that poll. All right. I'll see you back here in 5. Well, y'all got some extra time because I forgot to start the timer. So you get an extra minute or so. Oh my goodness, we still have 3 minutes left in the break, but I wanted to thank Jam Time 10 for subscribing with Prime. Thank you so much, Jam. I really, really do appreciate it. And since they did subscribe with Prime, it doesn't cost them anything. So if you are a Prime subscriber, like Amazon Prime um, user or subscriber, you do have a free Prime subscription associated with your account. So feel free to use that on your favorite streamer. It does not have to be me. It could be anyone that you enjoy their content, and show them some love. So thank you again, Jam Time, and let's make Jeff Bezos sell his cowboy hat to pay for all these Prime subs. Thank you, Jam. Okay, folks, we got about a minute left in the break. You got a little bit extra time to stretch out your body and your brain over this break because I forgot to start the timer. But we are counting down the final minute now. So if you didn't get up and do anything during the break, if you are able, please do get up and stretch and get a drink of water or tea or whatever. Pet your dog, pet your kid, pet your significant other with their permission, and then come on back. All right, I'm going to go ahead and stop the timer with 8 seconds remaining because it's going to take me that long to get my stuff sorted out. All right, let me get my camera turned back on. Welcome back, folks. Good to see you all still here. Whereas Leon says, "Kiss your baby." Absolutely. I usually just pet my dog during the breaks. That served me pretty well. What's your deja vu there, Crytek? Also, we have the poll. So the poll that Third Decade requested is available now at the top of your chat window. So at the top of your chat window, you will see a poll. You can click on that poll in order to cast your vote. So please do, as Third Decade requested, so they can see how many of you have used modern React to build a project. I wasn't able to fit the whole question in there. It has a character limit. But yeah, essentially, Third Decade is just wondering whether you have used modern React. So talking about hooks, state, all that kind of thing, and the modern version of React in a personal or professional project. Okay, now before we move on to the next section, I do want to take a look and sort of show you how some of these concepts that we just discussed in this section, talking about components, rendering something from a component into HTML in the DOM, components all the way down, like nesting components and building everything out as components, how that actually looks in the real world. So we talked a little bit earlier about the Khan Academy website. And as I mentioned before, if you're a part of 100 devs, one of the early assignments when we're learning about HTML and CSS is to actually take this website and try to mimic it, mimic its look and feel, using nothing but HTML and CSS. And that's a fun project to do. However, if we inspect it, what we'll see here, we'll move this over a little bit, is kind of what we expect, right? What we see a bunch of HTML, and that looks like what we might try to build. It's obviously there's a lot going on here, but that looks very familiar, right? We don't see any evidence of these funky custom components or capital. We don't see any capital letters in the tags here, right? And because, as we discussed, that's not what the browser sees. JSX handles that first, and then by the time it hits the browser, it looks just like our good friend HTML that we know and love. However, if we dig a little deeper, we can actually see that there's something else going on here. So I have React DevTools installed in Chrome, and so I can actually see the components that build this site. So if I open the React DevTools and I click on components, we can see a massive, deep list of React components that work together to build this page. And like the React doc mentions, a lot of the times these sites are literally components all the way down. And now we can see here, look at all these, all these capitalized components. We've got, and some of them are just single letters, but yeah, right? It's crazy, isn't it? We have all of these nested components that are all prompting different behavior. It's components all the way down, baby. And what you might see, for example, here and here, is the same component being referenced more than once, right? For a particular reason. We can't really tell why these things are being called the way they are, but we can see a lot of repetition. We're reusing elements to repeat the same behaviors over and over. Yeah, then this is pretty, like, this is kind of spaghetti, but I thought this site was a good example because we've all built it out as HTML and CSS, but that's not really what is powering the site. What's really powering the site is a crap ton of React. So how it looks on the surface isn't actually what's the brains behind this site. It's React. It's not, and I'm not saying that you have to understand this or this is the type of thing you're going to be building. But it's just good to understand that sometimes there's a little bit more than meets the eye. Okay, so I just wanted to, I didn't want to skip over that, but let's close that. And also too, if you install React DevTools on inside of your browser of choice, yeah, if you install React DevTools, it's just an extension. You can install React Developer Tools and once you install it, any website that you visit, you will be able to tell immediately whether it is using React or not. And you'll be able to do just what I did there and inspect it, look at the components. You can even see, once we start talking about props and state and that kind of thing, you'll even be able to see what props are being passed into an individual component and the flow of those props down through the nested components, and then how that state gets set and everything. So if you a great way to learn about how these concepts are applied in the real world is to look at real life examples. And so if you install React Dev Tools, you'll be able to do just that. Visit real sites and see how they behave under the hood using React. All right. So I would highly recommend it. And you might see that some sites use React in ways you don't expect, and some sites that you would expect might use React or should use React, they don't. And this tool can tell you that. It's kind of fun to just poke around. All right, so we finished up with your first component. Woo! Hiya! Thank you so much for the Prime sub. I really appreciate it. Oh, wow, another Prime sub, and it didn't cost them anything because you get one Prime sub included with your Amazon Prime subscription. So thank you so much, Hiya and Jam Time. Thank you so much for using that sub on me. However, if you are a Prime subscriber, just use it on your favorite streamer. I mean, could be PewDiePie or whatever. Is PewDiePie still streaming? No, I don't know. It doesn't matter who it is, but use it on someone. Don't let it go to waste. Make Jeff Bezos sell his cowboy hat. All right. So we finished up with just learning the basics of what components are and how we can use them. Hey, Ahmed, how's it going? Now let's talk about importing and exporting components. So the magic of components lies in their reusability, just like we saw on the Khan Academy site, the same components used over and over and over and over and over again. You can create components that are composed of other components, like we saw with the gallery. The gallery component calls upon the profile component multiple times. But as you nest more and more components, it often makes sense to start splitting them into different files. This lets you keep your files easy to scan and reuse components in more places. So in this section, we'll learn what a root component file is, how to import and export a component, when to use default and named imports and exports, how to import and export multiple components from one file, and how to split components into multiple files. Because, as we saw, there can be a crap ton of components in an app or in a project. And so you want to build your structure, your folder structure, so that it's clear and makes sense, and you can call components when you need them. Jack says, I didn't see that. I went through 100 devs and I am now a React dev. That's friggin' rad, Jax. Congratulations. I know there's several folks that went through 100 devs that have transitioned into React and are learning it on the job, which is it's really awesome. I mean, that's how I learned SQL. That's how I started my career, was learning on the job what I needed to know. And it's surprisingly effective. When you have to learn something in order to not get fired, it's a pretty good motivator. All right. And Elias says, will you be going over what should and shouldn't be a separate component? So it depends on, what you mean by that, but we're going to go over how you can separate out components. And then later on, so right now we're going to talk about the mechanics of it, right? If we have a separate component, how do we import it? How do we export it? And so we can call it later. And later on, we're going to be going over how, if we have one big component, and we determine that it might be better as smaller components, like a couple of smaller components, if we see some repetitive logic and that kind of thing, we'll go over how to take that logic out and put it in its own component, right? And clean things up a little bit. So we will cover that, maybe not necessarily in this section, but it is covered, yes. Okay, so let's talk about the root component file. So in the previous section, we made a profile component and a gallery component that renders it. And as we recall, we declared our function component here, and then we immediately called it in our gallery component. So these currently live in a root component file named app.js. In this example, in create React app, your app lives in source/app.js. Depending on your setup, your root component could be in another file though. If you use a framework with file-based routing, such as Next.js, your root component will be different for every page. So essentially, there's just a like what they say. It's a root file. It's a single file from which you can call other components that you've declared in other files and render them out. So what if you want to change the landing screen in the future and put a list of science books there, or place all the profiles somewhere else? It makes sense to move gallery and profile out of the root component file. This will make them more modular and reusable in other files. So instead of declaring them and then immediately using them in the same file, why don't we move them out into separate files? And so then we can call them from any location, wherever we want. So you can move a component in 3 steps. Make a new file to put the component in, export your function component from that file using either default or named exports, which we'll talk about in a minute, import it in the file where you'll use the component. Using the corresponding technique for importing default or named exports. So essentially, like I said, it's maybe something that you've done before when you've set up a mongoose schema, or maybe set up some controllers that call other controllers. You may have had a very complex controller and you have it pulling information from other files. It's really similar to that. So now, if we look down at this example here, we now have our root file, which is app.js, and a separate file for gallery.js, which is where our components are going to live now. Here, both profile and gallery have been moved out of app.js and into a new file called gallery.js. Now, you can change app.js to import gallery from gallery.js. Hey, Brown Skills, how's it going? So let's look at this. We have our import statement here. We're importing gallery from gallery.js. And now we have our sort of root component here, which simply calls gallery. So let's look inside of gallery.js and see what's happening there. Now we can see that it's all the same logic that we had before, right? We still have our profile, and then we have our gallery component, which is calling profile 3 times, but we're simply exporting it and then calling it inside of our root. Now you might say, okay, why would we bother? Why would we bother doing that? But as they said above, your pages are going to be more complex than just 1 or 2 components. You're going to have headers and sidebars and I don't know, forms and articles and lists and all these different things that are going to come together and assemble to build the finished page. And so it's going to be a lot cleaner if you simply have them in their own locations, import them into your app.js, and just call them as tags. That's going to look very clean. You could have header, list, images, whatever, and then footer, and it's going to be like a list of, maybe 6 or 7 tags. And so it's going to be very clean. So our example is broken down into 2 component files now. We have our gallery.js, which defines the profile component, which is only used within the same file and not exported. So there's no export statement on profile. And then we export the gallery component as a default export. And then app.js imports gallery as a default import from gallery.js, and then exports the root app component as a default export so it can be displayed. All right. Elias says, I'm just rebuilding this WordPress website using React before I add new stuff to it, and I'm trying to figure out what the components should be. Yeah, so that's what we can call thinking in React. So how do we think in terms of individual components? There's actually, Elias, if you're already in the mix with React, go to the Quick Start Guide, and there is a section called Thinking in React. And I would highly suggest reading it. It'll help you learn how to compartmentalize things into components and what logical relationships you might have between those components. So check out the Quick Start Guide. And if you're already comfortable with the basics of React and you just want to learn how to think in terms of components, I would suggest the Quick Start Guide and then the Thinking in React section. Yeah, that one. Yep. Okay. So one thing to note when we're looking at imports and exports, you may encounter files that leave off the JS file extension like so. So import gallery from gallery. Either gallery.js or /gallery will work with React, though the former is closer to how native ES modules work. So there's just one thing to note. Either one will work. I know I've done both. Um, Either one will work. All right, so you might have kind of seen that this, like when we're talking about imports and exports, they're talking about like defaults, default import, default export. What does that mean? So let's take a look at what we mean by default versus named exports. So there are two primary ways to export values with JavaScript: default exports and named exports. You may have seen both when you've been importing and exporting things with JavaScript in your apps. So far, our examples have only used default exports, but you can use one or both of them in the same file. A file can have no more than one default export, but it can have as many named exports as you like. Um, so here's an example. We're exporting a single function, and so export default. Here we have more than one export. We're exporting two functions, and so in that case, we can just say export function whatever, and that will work. And you can also have a named export and a default export. So how you export your component dictates how you must import it. You will get an error if you try to import a default export the same way you would a named export. That was word salad. So we'll look at the table here and that'll be a little clearer. This chart can help you keep track. So depending on how you export something determines how you import it. So if you have a single export, you're probably going to do an export default, and you would export it in this way: export default function, whatever. And then when you want to call that later on, import it, you would just say import button from button.js. For a named export, which is just export function, whatever, with no default, you would import it in a slightly different way. You would add curly braces around the name of the thing you are importing, and then, same as before, just the file path. So the only real difference here is that you're adding curly braces around the name of the thing you're exporting. And the main difference, the difference here is when you write a default import, you can put any name you want after import. For example, you could write import banana from /button.js, and it would still provide you with the same default export. In contrast, with named imports, the name has to match on both sides. That's why they're called named imports. So if you have multiple functions or multiple components that you are exporting and importing into the same location, you're going to essentially have to use at least one named import, and that name has to match the export on the other side. Yeah. So you might say, okay, why do we care? Why does this even matter? Well, people often use default exports if the file exports only one component. Okay, so sure, you use the default. So you're only exporting one thing, use the default. Use named exports if it exports multiple components and values. So if you have multiple components in the same file, you're going to have to use named exports, which force you to use the name of the thing you are exporting. So in order to make sure that your code stays true to what it's actually exporting and importing, you have to use the name that you declared. So that component name, you have to say, I am exporting this component. So buttons, sliders, whatever, you have to use that specific name. Regardless of which coding style you prefer, always give meaningful names to your component functions and the files that contain them. Components without names are discouraged because they make debugging harder. So just name your stuff. That'll make sure that you don't lose track of what you're exporting and importing. Give things logical names. Don't use single letter names, kind of like for variables, right? Don't be stingy with your variable names. Thank you for the follow, Brunel Dev. All right, so exporting and importing multiple components from the same file. So you might not always be exporting multiple things from the same file, but a lot of the times you are going to be importing multiple things into the same file, right? You're gonna want to call multiple. You're gonna want to render multiple components in the same file. Once when you call them, you're going to be importing. I want to import button, header, sidebar, and you're going to be importing them all at once. So how do we do that? What if you wanted to just show one profile instead of a gallery? You can import the profile component too, but gallery.js already has a default export and you can't have two default exports. You could create a new file with a default export, or you could just add a named export for profile. A file can only have one default export, but it can have numerous named exports. So we'll see an example of that in a little bit. To reduce the potential confusion, some teams choose to only stick to one style or avoid mixing them in a single file. It's a matter of preference. Do what works best for you. Yeah, I prefer like just using named exports and imports because I feel like it's all this is so confusing. It's, if I have more than one thing ever, it's usually one style or another. But first, you would export profile from gallery.js using a named export function profile. Then import profile from gallery.js to app.js using a named import with the curly braces, right? So that's what we saw in that little table. When you export a function as a named export, you need to import it with the proper syntax. And then we would render profile from the app component. Now, gallery.js contains two exports, a default gallery export and a named profile export. App.js imports both of them. Try editing profile to gallery and back in this example. Don't use single letters like Khan Academy. Yeah, name your components properly. All right, so let's look at how they've changed this here. Might make a little more sense if we look at a proper example, because this is a very word salady, right? So what are they doing here, right? We already had the export default function gallery. That was already there. All of this was there before. But we realized, oh, hey, I actually want to, so gallery is calling profile, but I also want to be able to call profile from within app.js too. I want to do both. I want to be able to call it in both places. So in order to do that, in order to call profile from within app.js, I need to export that as well. However, I already have a default export here. So I need to make this a named export, which is not hard. I just add the word export, right? Now it's a named export. Okay, now I want to be able to call both gallery and profile from within my app.js. So what do? I need to import them. I was already importing gallery as a default import. That was there before. But I also want to import profile, which was a named export. So I need to use the proper syntax in order to import it. Slightly different. We can see the difference, right? I was already importing gallery. Now I import profile as a named import, and I can call it just fine. So if we can do either one here. I can change this to be gallery. Ta-da! Or I could change it to be, well, I can do both here. Let me just do this. Oh, I need to wrap it in a fragment. Sorry. Just do that. Don't mind me. There we go. So we can see I'm rendering both the gallery, which is these three here, and the profile. Yeah, and like Brunel says, everybody has their own preference, right? I like to use, it depends on how many components you have in a file. If I have a single in a file, I might just use the default. Or, everybody has your preference. As you get familiar with what this is and what you're doing here, it doesn't really matter as long as you can keep track of it. Yeah, so Skunk has asked, I often see components defined with const component name and then an arrow function and then export in a separate statement. Is there any benefit for that, or is it just style choice? So that's using the newer arrow function syntax, which JavaScript you know, that's a I think that's from ES6. Arrow function syntax is still fairly new, so it's not here in the React docs. I kind of wish it was, but and then you can you can have export as a separate statement. I don't know if there's any change in behavior. I've used both. I've used both this syntax that they're telling us here, and then the newer arrow function syntax. But yeah, somebody might be able to chime in whether there's actually a difference in behavior there, or if it's just a difference in the way we write it. All right, so now we're using a mix of default and named exports, which we already kind of covered. And so here what we've learned is what a root component file is. So often when you look at a real life React application, you're going to see that you have a root file, which is generally an app.js, and then you're just importing a bunch of components from other locations and displaying them, and rendering them within app.js. All right, so let's do a quick challenge here. We're going to split our components. So currently gallery.js exports both profile and gallery, which is a bit confusing. Move the profile component to its own profile.js and then change the app component to render both profile and gallery one after another. Okay? You may use either default or named export for profile, but make sure that you use the corresponding import syntax. You can refer to the table from the deep dive above. Okay, so what do we have here? We have app.js, which is currently rendering profile. And we can see that they've got it kind of set up as before. We're importing gallery as a default and importing profile as a named import. So what do they want us to do? Move profile component to its own profile.js. Okay, so they've got a file set up for us here where we're supposed to put profile.js, and then change the app component to render profile and gallery one after another. Okay, so what we'll do is I'm going to add my gallery tag here in app.js. I want them both to render. So we can see that that works as is, right? But that's not everything that they wanted us to do. They wanted us to also go in here, take this profile function, and move it to profile.js. Okay. And I need to also change the name of my file here, .js. All right. And then export function profile. See export, and that is got the export statement there. Port. All right. Okay, what am I missing here? Profile is not defined. Oh, haha. I forgot my import statement in gallery, right? That was the problem because it's calling on profile, but since I've moved it, I need to add my import statement. So let's grab profile and import it. Oh, there we go, fixed. Hooray. So what did we do here? Well, we added profile to render on the root page. And then we also moved profile to its own file. But when we did so, we had to remember to import it wherever and whenever we wanted to render it. So that's what we did here. Yeah. Dr. Moto says you don't need that JS extension in the import, right? Well, yeah, React can work with both. I think I usually put the extension just because it helps me keep track of things. And Brunel has come up with a fantastic answer for the question I asked earlier about should we be using when we're creating components? Is it better? Like, is there a specific reason why we might want to use the older function notation versus the more the more modern arrow function? notation. So they say there's a discussion about using constant function with memory allocation, that maybe in some specific cases, using const might lead to multiple renders and excess usage of memory. But this is about inside a component. But this is about being inside a component. But the function, but the sorry, I lost my. But the component itself being a function or a const, I haven't found any studies about the benefits of it. So it seems like whichever one you prefer, you are welcome to use. Now, the docs use function notation, so we will be using that to follow along with the docs. However, if you want to have a little challenge and convert the stuff that we're doing here into arrow notation, go ahead and do it. Yeah, that might be a fun challenge. But thank you, Brunel, for that wonderful explanation. Amazing scientist, there can only be one. Yeah, for now, we only have one amazing scientist, right? But we're going to learn how we can make it so this is not the case. And so our components don't have to render the same way every single time. We can manage their behavior using what we call props. Okay, I think that's enough of that. Now let's get into the more fun stuff. Let's talk about um, writing markup with JSX. So remember, when we talk about markup here, what we're talking about is something that looks like HTML but isn't. It looks to us like HTML when we're writing it, but JSX, under the hood is doing something different there and then spitting it out as finished HTML into the browser. So, writing markup with JSX. JSX is a syntax extension for JavaScript that lets you write HTML like markup inside of a JavaScript file. Although there are other ways to write components, most React developers prefer the conciseness of JSX, and most code bases use it. Yeah. And that's what I don't know that I've ever seen something other than JSX used for this sort of thing, but I'm curious if anybody else has encountered that. We'll need props so we don't have to have a Highlander battle of science. Yeah. Thank you, Brunel. That's fantastic. Thank you for sharing your knowledge with us. I really appreciate it. It's fantastic to have some experts in the chat here. Hey, Death Knight. Rex asks, "Is this like Jinja or Django templating?" Maybe somebody else could answer that question. I've not worked with Jinja or Django, but somebody else maybe can answer that. So in this section, we're going to learn why React mixes markup with rendering logic. Why are we doing this? How JSX is different from HTML, and how to display information with JSX. So the web has been built on HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. For many years, web developers kept content in HTML, right? Design in CSS, and logic in JavaScript. We have what we call the separation of concerns. Um, and often, our HTML, CSS, and JavaScript are in separate files. Content was marked up inside of HTML. So, assigning IDs and classes and things, and having CSS control how that then looks on the page. And then the page's logic lives separately in JavaScript. So here we have an example of some plain old HTML and then some various functions that potentially could be triggered by the user interacting with that HTML. But as the web became more interactive, logic increasingly determined content. JavaScript was in charge of the HTML. And we see that a lot, right? You have a user, submitting a form, but then what is rendered back on the page is controlled by a bunch of JavaScript logic and controllers behind the scenes that are figuring out what to get back from the database and are figuring out what, maybe what options to give the user based on a bunch of logic in controllers, behind the scenes somewhere. And then that is then spit back out as HTML. So in today's web, logic determines content, not the other way around. So that is why in React, rendering logic and markup live together in the same place inside of components. So here's an example of a React component, which contains, both what we would consider JavaScript logic and also HTML tags at the same time. So it's a simple if condition. It says, hey, if the user is logged in, give them some text that says welcome. Otherwise, give them a form, probably presumably a login form. And then here's another component, which is the form component, which says, calls a couple functions and then displays what we would consider an HTML form. So keeping a button's rendering logic and markup together ensures that they stay in sync with each other on every edit. Conversely, details that are unrelated, such as the button's markup and a sidebar's markup, are isolated from each other, making it safer to change each of them on their own. And that's another important thing as well. You don't want to have something that you're unable to change because it's going to have a cascade effect and screw up everything else on the page, right? You don't want to, it's like trying to change something in Microsoft Word, changing an image position, and it, shifts everything down by 10 pages. You don't want something like that in your code. And so if you can encapsulate these sorts of things in their own components, you can change a component without fear of it having a dangerous ripple effect on everything else. Each React component is a JavaScript function that may contain some markup that React renders into the browser. React components use a syntax extension called JSX to represent that markup. JSX looks a lot like HTML, but it is a bit stricter, which we will see, and it can display dynamic information. That's a big difference, right? HTML is not dynamic. HTML is, the tags you see are what you get. Is what's there is what you get. So if we want dynamic content, we need some help with that. And there's various ways that you can do that. EJS and that sort of thing. But but React allows you to have this dynamic sort of HTML rendering. The best way to understand this is to convert some HTML markup to JSX markup. So JSX and React are two separate things. They are often used together, but you can use them independently of each other. JSX is a syntax extension, while React is a JavaScript library. So often you will see these two go hand in hand. But I mean, I could write, plain JavaScript in JSX and it wouldn't care. I could use JSX for, my vanilla app for some reason. It wouldn't matter. I don't have to use it with React, but they're often used together. Thank you, MME Cotton. They say Jinja works more similarly to EJS in my opinion. Okay. Yeah. All right, so let's convert some HTML to JSX and see the difference. So this is some valid HTML, right? We've got an H1 tag, an image tag with some stuff in it. We've got, these are all properties of an image tag. You got your source with your image URL. You've got your alt text, and then you've got a class for assigning some CSS. And then we have a unordered list. It's got 3 list items, very standard. Now let's say I want to just take this HTML and plop it into a component, a React component, and then that'll render, and I want it to look exactly the same. It'll just be inside of a React component. So if I write out my little shell, export default function to-do list, and then I want it to return this HTML, let's see what happens if I just plop my HTML straight in there. So that's what they've done here, exporting the function, and then they're returning h1 image tag ul li blah blah. Okay, we can see that there's some problems here, right? It doesn't necessarily like that. It's giving us some errors. And that's because JSS is stricter and has a few more rules than HTML. And Dr. Moto has pointed out one of those rules, but there are actually more. If you read the error messages above, they'll guide you to fix the markup, or we can follow the guide below. So let's see if we can fix this markup. And Dr. Moto has actually pointed out the first problem. So adjacent JSX elements must be wrapped in an enclosing tag. And you saw, if you were paying attention, you saw me do this earlier, right? Previously, I was trying to render the profile and the gallery components one after the other, and it errored out when I tried to do that because I needed to wrap it in a fragment. And we'll learn why that is a little bit later. So we'll explain what this is in a minute, but for now, just know that if you have multiple elements, you're returning multiple elements, you need to wrap them in what we call a fragment. And again, we'll talk about this in a minute. Don't worry. Oops. I can't type carrots today for some reason. Okay, so that's one problem. Now let's read what the next error is. Expected corresponding JSX closing tag for LI. So what do we think I might need here? What do you think this is asking for? Expected corresponding JSX closing tag for LI. Based on that error text, what should I add? Yeah, it clearly seems to be asking for a closing tag, right? So let's try that. Let's add a closing tag to this. Yeah. So it's happy with the first one now. So I'll add a few more. Boop, boop. All right. Okay. Now I'm going to need to do a couple more things. One of them is also closing my image tag, as Dr. Moda mentioned. So I think if I just do this, there we go. Okay, so now we're closer. So essentially what you're seeing here is kind of a trend, right? I need to make sure all of my tags are closed, including my image tag. In order to do that, I just added a closing marker. And so now it displays, but there's still one thing wrong. So now we've got an error in the console, and it says, warning, invalid DOM property class. Did you mean class name? And yes, I did. Because if we're writing in JSX, there are certain keywords in JavaScript which are reserved keywords and can't be used in other contexts. And so in order to specify them here, I need to change them slightly. I think I'm missing what am I missing here? At image, at to-do list. So I changed that to be class name. Still doesn't like it, but that is what I have to do. I think everything else is right there. Oh, thank you for the follow, K Lil Pixel. Yeah, so this will be what we'll talk about why this is, but yeah, that's what you need to do. I think if I were to able to refresh the console, I think that would probably go away. All right. So I know that was kind of fast that we went through those things, but we're going to break down each of the changes that I made and why we had to make those changes. So never fear. All right. So as we saw, JSX has a few more rules than HTML, right? I can't just dump basic HTML inside of a React component and make it work. I need to do a little bit more. So, as they said, most of the time, React's on-screen error messages will help you find exactly where the problem lies. Give them a read if you get stuck. Yeah, the React error messages are generally quite good, so don't panic if you get an error. Just follow the messages to solve it. All right, so what are the rules of JSX? Well, the first rule and the most important rule is that whenever you are returning a bundle of tags, to return multiple elements from a component, you have to wrap them in a single parent. So from what we've seen so far, just like returning a single H1 tag with some text in it is going to be no problem. React is going to accept that. However, if I wanted to return, like we saw above, if I want to return an H1 and an image tag and a list all at the same time, in order for that to work properly, I need to wrap it in a single tag. And so, for example, here they're using a div, right? Here they're using a div, but you don't have to. You can use what we call a fragment, which is kind of looks like an empty HTML tag, which is what you saw me use earlier, right? It's just empty caret and then empty carets with a slash in it. And that's all you need to do. If you're returning multiple tags, multiple HTML elements, just wrap them in a fragment and they'll work. And this empty tag is called a fragment. Fragments let you group things without leaving any trace in the browser HTML tree. So what essentially all we're doing here is we're telling React, hey, I'm bundling a bunch of tags together. So when you render these out in the DOM as HTML, they need to be grouped together in the DOM, right? They need to be grouped exactly as they look right here, all together as a bundle. And so if we were to render this out in the DOM, we would see it all grouped together just as it is here. What you see is what you get, um, except these fragment tags would be gone. So why do multiple JSX tags need to be wrapped? Well, because JSX looks like HTML, but under the hood, it is transformed into plain JavaScript objects. We keep saying that over and over, but I think it bears repeating. It's easy to think, oh, well, this looks like HTML. I'm writing HTML. No, you are not. You are writing something that looks like HTML on the surface, but gets transformed into plain JavaScript objects and then renders out to the DOM as HTML. You can't return two objects from a function without wrapping them into an array. This explains why you can't also return two JSX tags without wrapping them into another tag or a fragment. So just like I said before, it's just a way for us to bundle multiple tags together, tell JSX that these tags need to stay together, and then render them out to the DOM the same way. So I hope that makes sense. It's easy to forget, but fortunately, the error messages are generally pretty descriptive, as we saw. And so it'll remind you that, hey, you may be meant to wrap these things in a fragment. You maybe want to add that. Blazing Saddles reference, yeah. All right, and then the second rule. So we talked about fragments. The second rule that we saw earlier when we were messing around with that example above was closing all the tags. So JSX requires tags to be explicitly closed. Self-closing tags, like image, must become image with a closer on the end. And wrapping tags like li must be written with an open and close as well. So just in general, close all the tags. Even ones that are singular, such as image. So we saw this earlier. We kept the image singular, the singular image tag as written, except we just added a little, closing slash to the end. That's all we needed to do. And then for our list item tag, we also added a closer there. So I hope that makes sense. And this is another thing, it'll give you an error and it'll remind you what you need to do, and you can just add a closer to it. The third rule is CamelCase most of the things. JSX turns into JavaScript, and attributes written in JSX become keys of JavaScript objects. In your own components, you will often want to read these attributes into variables, but JavaScript has limitations on variable names. For example, their names cannot contain dashes or be reserved words like class. And we mentioned that earlier, right? There are certain words that you cannot use in any other context, and class is one of them. So if we want to render out an HTML tag with a class associated with it, but we're doing it in JSX, we need to alter the name slightly. So this is why in React, many HTML and SVG attributes are written in CamelCase. For example, instead of stroke dash width, you use stroke width in CamelCase. And since class is a reserved word, in React, you write class name instead. So this is the most common one that I think you'll see is class with an and then name with an uppercase N. And when that renders out to the DOM, you'll see it just like you would expect, but just the word, class. But just remember, if you're writing it out in React, you're gonna need to use class name instead. And by far, I think that's the most common one. There's others, but again, it'll error out and it'll say, "Did you mean whatever?" And you can just fix it yourself. You can find all of these attributes in the list of DOM component props. If you get one wrong, don't worry. React will print a message with a possible correction to the console. Absolutely, and it will. If you screw it up, It's okay. React will try to hold your hand and tell you what it should have been instead. And that's been my primary method of learning about these differences in naming conventions. I mean, because I'll just try to write it as I would if I was writing an HTML tag, and then I get an error in the console and I fix it and I remember it for next time, or I don't and I just get another error. So it's okay, um, but just note that there are differences. And I don't really understand this one, but it says for historical reasons, aria dash star and data dash star attributes are written as in HTML with dashes. So I don't know what those are, and I've never seen them, but maybe you have, and so FYI for you. And then the final thing they say is just as a pro tip, just use a JSX converter. So converting if you have some existing HTML code and you want to convert it and put it into a React component, um, you might as well just use a converter to do it for you. So you don't have to do it by hand. Converters are very useful in practice, but it's still worth understanding what's going on so that you can comfortably write JSX on your own. So here's the final result, which we basically already did, right? We just following the error messages up above, we were able to take the HTML and convert it into valid JSX using nothing but the error messages to guide us. All right, so now we know why JSX exists and how to use it in components. React components group rendering logic together with markup because they are related. And JSX is similar to HTML with a few differences. You can use a converter if you need to. So if you already have a bunch of HTML written out, you want to dump it into React, just use a converter. And then error messages are quite verbose and good, and they will often point you in the right direction to fixing your markup. Data are custom elements. Okay. I think ARIA wildcard is an accessibility cement. Oh, that's right. It is. You're correct. Yeah. ARIA is accessibility. Yeah. Yep. That is, yep. I remember now. Thank you for that. I got some real good space repetition there, like months apart. Okay, it's time for a break. But when we come back, we're going to do this challenge and we're going to convert some HTML to JSX. So you're welcome to do this over the break if you want, or when we come back, we will do it together. We'll walk through and we'll do another conversion of HTML to JSX. So let's take 5 minutes. And when we come back, a little conversion. All right, please do get up, get a drink of water, whatever you need to do. Coffee time! Yeah. Oh, thank you, Beanie. Now this is helping me as much as it's helping you. So it's mutually beneficial. All right, 5 minutes. When we come back, we'll do the challenge, then we'll go on to the next section. Okay. See you back in 5. Get up, stretch, do what you got to do. See you back here soon. Okay, folks, we got about a minute left in the break. So get a drink of water, get up and stretch. I know I've been sitting down for the past 4 minutes. Just do whatever the opposite is that you've been doing this whole time. Sitting down, standing up, whatever it is, do the opposite for a minute. Get a drink of water, pet your dog, pet your friends, pet your significant other with their permission, and then come on back. All right, folks, I'm going to go ahead and stop the timer. And get my camera back on. Welcome back, everybody. And Type Error Dev went ahead and confirmed for us. They say ARIA. So we were talking about ARIA earlier, and that is an accessibility. Let's see, it's an accessibility specification. It stands for Accessible Rich Internet Applications. It consists of markup that can be added to HTML in order to communicate the roles, states, and properties of user interface elements to assistive technology. So, if you want to make your application more accessible to those who use assistive technology that looks at the web in a different way, then yeah, you should probably be familiar with how those tags work. And then if you're using React, you'll definitely want to make sure that you can translate those ARIA features into your React application. So that's where a converter would probably be a good thing to help make sure that you get all of those right the first time, especially if they may not be obvious to someone who isn't using assistive technology. So I appreciate you looking that up, Type Error. And yeah, that's great info. Much appreciated. Okay, so let's take a look at this challenge. So, any thoughts? What do we see here? What is something that this does not have, or what's something we need to change? Since we've already kind of done one of these, let's see if we can kind of work through it um, based on what you all think. What do we need? I'm going to hydrate here for a second. Or what's a change that we need to make to this JSX in order to make it work? Yeah. One of the things we'll need is a wrapper. Now, what is the proper name for when we have a wrapper? Yeah. It's actually exactly. It's called a fragment, right? We can use what we call a fragment. We could also wrap this in like a div or something like that. But if I don't want to add an extra div just for the sake of wrapping my tags, like if I don't really need that div, I'm probably what I'm going to do instead is just, oops, why can't I write carrots today, guys? Gosh. I'm going to just add a fragment on the outside. Yeah. So there's one. Good. Yeah, and another change we're going to need to make is changing our class to class name. And the second one. That's great. TJ says, thanks for uploading to YouTube. Definitely been helping. I'm in class 35. Oh, that's rad. Yeah. No, I always upload my stuff to YouTube after a few weeks. And pro tip, my YouTube channel is ad free. So if Twitch ads drive you up the wall and they're preventing you from watching my content, just wait till it's on YouTube and you can watch it ad free. I don't want any of my stuff to be behind paywalls. I would disable ads on Twitch if I could, but I can't. So unfortunately, I'm stuck with that. But at least on YouTube I can avoid monetization. So yeah. All right. What else do we have here? So let me see what y'all are saying. Drunk Uncle Grandma says, back in my day, the empty fragment actually had to write fragment in it. You still do sometimes, but for the most part, you can shorthand it. Okay. So what else do we need? What else is it telling us here? So folks are saying, okay, self-closing BRs. Let's see, did I do that right? No, we'll see. And we've got class name. Okay, yep, got to restructure the I tag and the B tag. Yeah, we got some weird stuff going on here with our I and our B, right? So what is it trying to do here? Let's see. I do this. Ooh, hello. Yes, there we go. All right, so now it is displaying. So this is semantically, this is okay. We've got our two break tags here. We've made them self-closing because they have to, right? Any tag, even if it's a singular one in regular HTML, has to close. So we've done that here. And we've made sure that we have open and close for each of the other tags as well. And we've also cleaned up our class name here a little bit to make sure that it's using the proper name for classes in React, which is class name instead of just class. And we've added our wrapper as well. So let's just look at the solution, make sure that's displaying properly. I think it is. Yes, it is. All right, good. So these, I just wanted to make sure that the outputs match, and they do. They are, so notice here, but notice the difference in their solution. So they chose to wrap this entire thing in a div, which is valid. They can do that. You can do that too. That's perfectly valid. What depends is whether you want your wrapper to actually display in the DOM or not, right? Do you want this to display in the DOM or not? In this case, this won't display, but this will. It'll display as a div, right? So it depends on your design. But yeah, so they've done class name as well, self-closing break tags, and they've cleaned up this weirdness that was going on with the B and I tags as well. Yeah. All right, good job, folks. We got it all first try. So way to go. All right. Let's go ahead. And so first off, before we move on, any questions on this? So any questions on the differences between writing plain old HTML and writing tags that are React friendly and that are going to render properly when we talk about React? So remember, the three rules of using JSX and components are return a single element. So wrap your tags into bundles. However you do that, whether it's with a fragment or a div or something else. Close all your tags, even self-closing ones like image, and CamelCase most everything. All right. So type error says, when you're writing React, when would you use .jsx or keep it as .js? So I'll say that when I am writing things in VS Code, for writing React app in VS Code, I just always suffix it as JSX because I want VS Code to properly look out for me, right, and tag things that aren't correct in JSX syntax. That's what I would do because I want that extra, squiggly line if I mess something up or use the wrong keyword or whatever. Yeah, I use it for linting purposes, but I haven't tried the other way. Does anybody know I'm asking chat here. Do y'all know when does and doesn't it matter? Because I don't think they actually have explicitly stated it here in the docs. I just always use JSX because I know I'm writing in JSX and I want to use all the proper handholding. But if linting was not, if I didn't worry about, what VS Code was going to yell at me for, what's the difference? And I'm genuinely asking. It's not a quiz question. Brunel says they both work. Usually on a project, you use JSX and JS to differentiate what is just a helper function, etc. So I assume you're talking about when you're defining a component versus just a helper function that only contains logic and it isn't going to spit out, isn't going to try to return any tags or anything like that. So helper functions that are in the background versus components that are actually interfacing with the front end of things. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. I feel like that's reasonable. Certainly. Thank you, Bruno. Yeah, it absolutely does make sense for just a helper function that's just a controller behind the scenes somewhere. Yeah, just JS is fine. It's interesting that they don't explicitly mention that here. I just find that odd, but maybe that'll be an enhancement later on in the docs. These are still in beta, so I'm sure there's room for improvement. All right, let's go on. I don't know that we're going to be able to get through the entire next section in the time that we have remaining. However, let's just see how far we get. So, excellent questions. Any other questions before we move on to the next section where we actually talk about how do we write real bona fide JavaScript inside of JSX with curly braces? All right, and as always, feel free to ask questions anytime you think of them. Um, all right, JavaScript in JSX with curly braces. So, yeah, Web Dev Simplified is an excellent channel. Um, yes, and they produce great content. They tend to go very fast. So similar to sort of Traversy, they tend to just kind of like boom, boom, boom. So um, you kind of I would suggest if you're going to watch them, pause, do the stuff yourself, then come back and go on to the next step. And Brunel says there's some React frameworks that cannot naturally read JSX like React Native. So yeah, okay. So on your pre-cons, you need to add support for JSX, but the same. But at the end of the day, React will spit everything back as JS. Yeah. No, I appreciate that. I didn't know that about React Native. Okay, so JSX lets you write HTML like markup inside of a JavaScript file, keeping rendering logic and content in the same place. And we talked about that in the last section. Sometimes you will want to add a little JavaScript logic or reference a dynamic property inside of that markup, right? You're going to want logic to control the behavior of your components. That's only natural. You're not going to want to render the same thing every time or under the same conditions. You're going to need you're going to need logic. I mean, that's the point of JavaScript, right? So in this situation, you can use curly braces inside of your JSX to open a window to JavaScript. So in this section, we're going to learn how to pass strings with quotes, how to reference a JavaScript variable inside JSX with curly braces, how to call a JavaScript function inside JSX with curly braces, and how to use a JavaScript object inside JSX with curly braces. Um, and as we started getting into this, you might start to notice some similarities to templating languages you might be familiar with, such as something like handlebars. That use of curly braces to enclose uh, what we would consider JavaScript logic inside of something that is not necessarily JavaScript. All right, so when we want to pass a string attribute to JSX, you put it in single or double quotes, which is what they're doing here. So we're familiar with that, right? We know strings go in single double quotes, so really no difference there. We're passing something that's a string, we enclose it in quotes. However, so this is hard coded, right? This is hard coded as a single URL, as a single class name, as a single alt text. If we wanted to make that dynamic and have it be controlled by a variable coming from somewhere else and then put it into our image tag, right? We wanted to essentially make the source of this image tag be a variable. Instead of the quote marks, we would use curly braces. So how would we do that? Well, here we've defined a constant with our URL and another constant with our description. And if we want to call upon those variables, we would simply enclose them in curly braces. So nothing particularly revolutionary there. Um, just a way to reference those variables inside of our tag. So curly braces. And I can make a site with no handlebars, no handlebars. Yep, that's a great song. I love that song. So notice the difference between class name equals avatar, which specifies an avatar CSS class name that makes the image round, and source avatar that reads the value of the variable called avatar. So it's a difference between hard-coded and dynamic reference. Um, that's because curly braces let you work with JavaScript right there in your markup. So JSX is a special way of writing JavaScript. That means it's possible to use JavaScript inside of it with curly braces. The example below first declares a name for the scientist as name and then embeds it with curly braces inside of the H1. So should look, fairly familiar, sort of almost like a template literal, right? We've defined a variable and then we can embed it inside of our H1 using curly braces. Thank you for the follow, Temmie. So again, it looks almost like a template literal, right? Except it doesn't have the bash $. And so we can try changing the name's value from Gregorio Y. Zara to Hedy Lamar, and the value will change because we're just referencing the variable. Ta-da! So any JavaScript expression will work between curly braces, including function calls like format date. So here we can see that we have a function, and what we're returning is this formatted date time, and we're calling upon this object of weekday with a single key value pair, weekday long, and formatting it as date. And what we're doing here down below is in the H1, we're saying to-do list for, and then whatever today's date is. So we're doing a couple things here. We can call a function inside of those curly braces and spit it out directly into our H1. And really, any JavaScript expression, as long as we wrap it in the braces, it's going to accept it. This reminds me a lot of handlebars. So you can only use curly braces in two ways inside of JSX. As text directly inside of a tag, but as text directly inside of a JS text. So we can put it inside of our open and close tags. However, we can't dynamically set up a tag, as like the tag name being a variable. So we can't do this where we have the tag name and then we reference a variable called tag. That's not going to work. And we can also use our curly braces as attributes immediately following the equals sign. So source equals avatar will read the avatar variable, but source equals, and then avatar in quotes, will pass a string of avatar. So I think that makes sense, right? Anything that you pass into JavaScript between quotes is going to be read as a string, no matter what that thing is. As long as you have your open and close quotes, it's going to read anything in there, no matter what it is, as a string. Now we can double down here a little bit and use double curlies. So in addition to strings, numbers, and other JavaScript expressions, you can pass objects in JSX, which makes sense. You would want to pass objects just like you would in regular JavaScript. Objects are also denoted with curly braces. Therefore, to pass a JS object in JSX, you must wrap the object in another pair of curly braces. So you get the double curlies because we already know that in JavaScript, objects are wrapped in curly braces. That's just how they are. So if you want to pass an object into JSX, you got to double up. And you may see this with inline CSS styles in JSX. React does not require you to use inline styles. Mostly, CSS classes are kind of the standard way of doing it. But when you need an inline style, you pass an object to the style attribute. So we can see that's what they're doing here. Essentially, they have a UL tag and they want to set a style inline, which is something that you can do in regular HTML, right? You can declare inline CSS. It's not something that we like to do. It's not something that we normally do, but there may be times when you want to or need to. And so in this case, they're doing that here, setting a style attribute on our UL and sending in more than multiple styles as an object wrapped in curly braces. However, since it is an object, it's already pre-wrapped in curly braces, and then to pass it in to JSX, we just wrap it in another set of braces. Now, let's see what happens if I take those braces off. I'm going to take off the outer, yeah. So as soon as I do that, it doesn't understand what I'm passing in. It can't read this as an object because it basically just says, hey, okay, I see a curly brace. They're passing something in, but it can't read it as an object. So I need to add my second set of braces in order for it to work. That's one thing I know that I've forgotten in the past, is because it's not strictly intuitive, right? We're used to just declaring an object with a single set of braces and then it works. It's an object, right? I angered it. Yeah, exactly. But we just have to remember why we need each set of braces, right? We need the outer set to tell JSX, hey, I'm passing in a JavaScript thing. And then the inner set here is actually outlining the object itself. I hope that makes sense. Because, yeah, it's something I've definitely forgotten in the past. And if you want to, you could, change up the styling a little bit to make it even more clear what you're doing. You could, do this and do that. Whoops. There we go. You could even make it more explicit by saying, all right, outer braces are my JavaScript and inside is my object. So the next time you see the double curlies, know that it's nothing more than an object inside the JSX curlies. Now, they have a pitfall here. Inline style properties are written in CamelCase. For example, in HTML, we could have style, background color black, and instead you would write that as, so here explicitly, the background color has a dash in the middle, right? We're used to writing inline styles that way. Or we're used to writing, CSS that way, right? You have a word dash, another word. But if you are doing inline styling in your components themselves, you would have to CamelCase it in order for it to follow the rules that we talked about in the last section, right? The rules that we talked about in the last section, rule number 3 was CamelCase almost everything. If it has a dash, it's not going to read properly, so you need to CamelCase it instead, and it will render out as you expect. However, I don't know about you guys, but I really don't use inline styles that often, unless I'm really only doing like one style for one single instance of styling for the entire project, and I don't want to have to bother with setting up CSS separately. But really, for the most part, I don't do inline styling. I don't know about you guys. Yeah, and as Mavi said, yep, when you do CSS this way, it's CamelCase and not dashed. So, font color or whatever is not going to be dashed, it's going to be CamelCased. So more fun with Type Error says, not with React, with HTML email templates. Yeah, yes, exactly. If you're doing something like email templates, you probably are going to be doing a lot of inline styling. But in most cases, probably, like for standard applications, probably not. So you can also move several expressions into one object and reference them in your JSX inside curly braces. So let's see what they've done here. So we have a person object, and we have our name here, and then we have a nested object inside of that with information about our theme. So down here, what we're returning is our style, which is enclosed in person.theme. So what we get out of here is when we call into this div, what we're actually passing is person.theme, which contains this object, which has both background color and color. So the style then is going to be this object containing both background color and color. And then referencing person.name. And yeah, that's about it. So what they're doing here is they're just basically, instead of having to have the whole object inside of our inline style, they've moved it out into, a separate variable, and then we're just calling that, well, it's moved it out into a separate object, and then we can simply reference that inside of the div. Brunel says, the good thing about inline style in React is because you're able to pass logic to it. Yeah, I suppose so. That's true. Instead of the standard, static inline styling that you'd have to do in regular HTML, as we saw, anything within the curly braces, you can pass logic in. So that could be an advantage, certainly. I appreciate that. Yeah, that's good to think about. So in this example, the person JavaScript object contains a name string and a theme object. And then the component can use the values from person like so. Yep. So we can call upon those objects and then the specific key values within that object. So JSX is very minimal as a templating language because it lets you organize data and logic using JavaScript. So JSX attributes inside quotes are passed as strings. We saw that earlier. Curly braces let you bring JavaScript logic and variables into your markup, and they work inside the JSX tag content or immediately after in attributes. And double curlies is not special syntax. It's a JavaScript object inside of JSX curly braces. All right, so let's do some challenges. I think we have enough time to get these done. So there's a mistake in this code, and this code crashes with an error saying objects are not valid as a React child. So let's see what's going on here. Show more here. All right, so we have our person object, and it contains name and a theme object with some styling information inside of it. Okay, so this object appears to be valid. I don't see anything wrong here. And down here, we actually have our component, which is to-do list. So we have a div, which is, again, calling our styles. So we're passing in an object with styling information into our style div here, our style attribute on our div. So that appears to be fine. And now here, we're calling on the person object to get the to-dos. Okay, what's the problem here? Anybody spot it? I think this is less of a it's less of a JSX problem and more of a general JavaScript logic problem. We've got a varying guesses here. Doesn't say which person. Well, fortunately, we only have one person that we're referencing, right? Everything's hard coded in this example. So what is the problem? Apostrophe S. No, that should be fine. When we are, so okay, let's look at this. Let's look at our style here. So what's happening here? We are going into the person object, right? And then we are finding the specific key value pair that we want to return, right? So we're saying, all right, inside of person, there is a key value called theme, and I want to return the value of that. I want to return this. Now, what do I want to return here? What am I trying to just conceptually? What do we expect to be in here? Yeah, exactly. Yep. So what we're actually trying to get is the person's name, right? And so we already know just from basic JavaScript logic that I need to get in here and return the actual property that I want. So in this case, it's actually person.name. Ta-da! Hooray, it works. So, I mean, I don't think that's actually like a very JSX specific question. Like, I mean, that would cause a problem even in plain old JavaScript, right? If it's expecting a string and you try to basically what it was doing when we did this, what it was doing when we just had person is it was trying to shove an object into the space that's meant for a string, right? And so that's not going to work. What we needed to we just needed to give it what it expected. Instead of returning the entire object, we need to get down to this specific value to return. Yeah. So this is happening because the example renders an object itself into the markup rather than a string, exactly like we just said. So that's all we need to do to fix it. Right. Dr. Moto says, make a pull request in the docs and do a better example. Well, I mean, I think it is still, it's still illustrative of a potential logic issue that you could run into. So I don't think it's bad. I just think it's more of a general reminder of how objects work, objects and their key value pairs work. And Brunel says, TypeScript is very good for these minor errors. It absolutely is. Yeah. TypeScript would immediately probably catch on the fact that this is trying to return a type of object. You know, if we just had person here, it would say, oh, hey, no, that's not compatible. You can't do that. This is not expecting an object. It's expecting a string, and that's not what you're giving it. So it would flag that. But in this case, unfortunately, we're not using TypeScript, so no bueno. Yeah, and Razwonder says, I'd love to see how React and TypeScript play together. Yeah, I think they would work together quite well, actually, given the strictness of, what we have to do to, I mean, given the strictness of JSX and React overall, I think it would play nice with TypeScript, probably. I haven't used it with TypeScript, but I think it would work well. All right, let's go on to the next challenge here. All right, extracting information into an object. Okay, extract the image URL into the person object. All right, so what do we got here? We've got our person object, and it's referencing it just the same as in example one. But we also have so we have our image tag down here, and it has a source URL. So I think what it's asking us to do is to, instead of hard coding it here, we want to put it as a member of the person object. And Mavi says, Veet is your new friend now for Raz Wonders. Yeah, and absolutely. Yeah, we actually went over Veet on our on my last stream a couple weeks ago. And yeah, it can help you set up a React project, a React and TypeScript project without you having to do it manually. It will do it for you. So I would suggest checking out that stream and getting Veet, up and running, and you can build very quickly, just have a basic React TypeScript project that is ready to go and has all the components that you need. And all you need to do is populate it, actually build the project on top of it. So I would highly suggest it. All right, so let's figure out how to fix this. So we want to take this and make it a part of the person object. So I'm going to say, I'm going to add it as a new key value pair here in our object. I'm going to say image URL, add it like that. And then I'm going to grab this and put it there. Now, what do I do if I want to reference this newly created key value pair down here inside of my image tag? How would I do that? Yeah, exactly. As type arrow dev said, all I need to do is set up my curly braces and just drop that in. And person, it's going to be person. Remember, I got to access the object first, and then what I want from that object, which is the image URL. Yay! So once again, not a particularly, I mean, you all have probably done this before, right? You've probably had in your JavaScript logic, you've probably had an object and you want to access a specific property of that object. And so in order to do that, you simply say, all right, what's the name of that object? And then what do I want from inside of it? And here, the only difference is that you're doing it in a tag and you're wrapping it in curly braces. So no biggie there. All right, let's go on to example 3. And for this third challenge, they want us to write an expression inside JSX curly braces. So in the object below, the full image URL is split into 4 parts: base URL, image ID, image size, and file extension. We want the image URL to combine these attributes together. The base URL, the image ID, the image size, and then the file extension, which is always .jpeg. However, something is wrong with how the image tag specifies its source. All right, so let's see what they got going on. What do we have here? We have our person object again, and we have these various properties of the image. Now, how are they trying to do it here? It's a little hard. I wish you could like change the size of the output. I can if y'all are having trouble seeing this, I can fork it to a new tab. I'll just go ahead and do that. And just pro tip, if you are working on these examples in the docs, as they get more complex, they're going to get like longer and wider. So in order to get more real estate on your screen, you can just click on the fork button in the top right, and that'll drop it into a new window for you, which is much bigger. I just need to see if I can zoom in here. You gonna let me zoom in? Really? Okay, there we go. That works. There. That's better. Okay. So how are they declaring the source? So they said the problem is in the source. So we've got base URL, curly braces, person, curly braces, person image size. All right. So what's wrong here? What's the biggest problem? This is doing something that the docs have told us we are not allowed to do. How is this going to be interpreted when it's passed into this tag? How is this going to be read? As it's currently written, how will this be read in? Yeah. Yeah, exactly. It's going to be read in as a string, right? And since we're dumping it into a tag, right, we get the little broken image icon because this is not, it's going to be read as a string, and that's not a valid URL. It's simply not going to work. Exactly. Yeah. So first off, that's wrong. Okay. Now, if I take that off, I get a whole new set of errors, right? Okay, so it's saying, so it doesn't like what I'm doing with the curly braces here. So I think the first thing I'm going to change is that I'm going to, I should be able to, theoretically, right, wrap, instead of having to try to do like separate references with the curly braces here, I should be able to just wrap all of this logic inside a single set of braces, right? I should just be able to do a concatenation inside of a single set of braces. So what I'm going to do is take this and this. I'm going to fix it. Don't worry. Then I'm going to do it the plus sign way. See that? Do that. Okay. And it's still, this is still wrong. So I'm going to take this, take out the JPEG, and I'm just going to concatenate that in there like that. Hey! All right, so what did we do there? Well, we took out the individual curly braces, sets of curly braces, and we simply just enclosed all of the logic that we wanted to do inside a single set of braces, right? Because that's valid. It's going to interpret anything inside of our braces as JavaScript logic. And so inside of those braces, all of this is valid JS logic. We can concatenate things together. We can concatenate strings together using the plus sign. And so that's what we've done here. We said, all right, take these strings, concatenate them together, and then simply add JPEG at the end. All right. Any questions on what we just did there? I know I went a little fast there on the final step. So if you're not getting this, feel free to ask. Like, what did we do? What did we start with? How did we get here? All that sort of thing. This is not my beautiful house. This is not my beautiful wife. And also too, if you've not been trying these, as we go back to the docs and do these yourself. Here's water. Yeah, somebody got it. Nice. Letting the days go by. There is water underground. Okay. So we started out with, this enclosed in strings, which is not valid because it's going to be passed into our source as a string of just all this junk. So that's not correct. And then when we took out the quote marks, it then tried to interpret each of these sets of curly braces separately and couldn't understand what we were trying to do. So instead, we just had to enclose all of the logic inside of a single set of braces and then add our JPEG suffix. And so what that turns out to be then is, I wonder, can I inspect this? Let's see. I'm not super familiar with this tool, so I'm wondering if I can. Yeah, we've got a bunch of errors in the console, but we fixed them. So can I? Is that gonna work? Yeah, there we go. So if we look at this, if we look at this in the console, it's a little bit behind my head there. No, I was on Steam earlier. You gonna let me? There we go. So if we actually look at this in the console, we can see then all that work that we did, what that renders out to then is our image URL, the specific image we want to access, and then our JPEG suffix. So it just all concatenates together and turns into a URL. So there you go. Okay, well, once again, man, I have like hit it like 2 times in a row of like my of perfect timing. I don't know how I'm doing so well, but I would think this is probably a good time to start wrapping things up. We've finished this section. We're about halfway done with the first sort of chapter of the JavaScript of the React docs, and so this is going to be a series. We're going to continue this. So what we're going to do next time is start getting into how we can make our components smarter, how we can make them react to other things on the page, to other changes in other components, how we can do things like conditional rendering, so have components that only render when specific conditions are met. So for example, when a user is logged in, render components X, Y, and Z. When they're not logged in, render a login form for them. So some conditional logic based on the current state of things on the page, right? Um, and so this is actually where we start getting into the really powerful part of React and what it's actually for. We've already seen a lot of advantages of React in the terms of reusability, in terms of strictness of tags, in terms of being able to encapsulate things, nest components, all that sort of thing. We've already seen a lot of advantages just structurally, but we haven't seen a lot of advantages in behavior just yet. And so that's what we're going to get into next time, where we start talking about props and state and that sort of thing. Now, we have plenty of time for questions here at the end. Oh, Phil Snabble asks, late to the party, but what is modern React? That's a great question. So, for a long time, React has been what we call, oh my gosh, Type Era Dev. Thank you for the 10 subs. Wow. Holy cripes on a cracker. Wow. If you just received a gifted sub from Type Era Dev, please thank them. Also, please check out the new emotes you now have access to. If you're a subscriber to my channel, you get custom little green wolf emotes that I think are adorable and I love them dearly. So feel free to use those in chat as much as you would like to. Now have access to that emote library as well. And yes, thank Type Era. And thank you, Typera Dev, for subscribing yourself. Oh wow, thank you. Y'all are feeling generous today. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Much appreciated, Typera Dev, and everybody else who subscribed and followed today. So to answer the question, uh, let me scroll back up and read it again. Okay, Fuel Snobble asked, late to the party, but what is modern React? So React started out as being very class based. So if you're familiar with like JavaScript classes, we can actually see that um, on the current JavaScript website. So there's plenty of examples there. So a component in old, I say old, in less modern React was defined, in a class. Um, and there were several, there were other different changes as well. Um, but those it was often a lot harder to you had to like mount and unmount components, um, and you had to like use the extend syntax and stuff for classes, and it was just a lot harder to pick up. More modern React uses what we call hooks, and we can use which are basically just standard JavaScript functions. um, you write it out just like you would a JavaScript function, and then you can call upon that component, um, almost like a custom HTML tag. You can just reference that component, you import it and export it just like you would a regular JavaScript function, and so it's mostly indistinguishable from writing a regular JavaScript function, which I think a lot of us are more familiar with than writing things in class-based syntax. Depending on if you're familiar with other languages, you might be really comfortable with classes, and you might like to write your React in that way. You can have your choice. So if you want to write React in the older way of doing things, you can use the docs that are right here on the reactjs.org homepage. So you can walk through those docs. They're all the class-based way of writing React. However, we are using the newer version of those docs, which is found at beta.reactjs.org, which is just the more modern way of doing it. And so the main difference I would say is that, um, you know, modern modern React is more function based. It's easier to pick up for those who are familiar with JavaScript and primarily with JavaScript and only JavaScript. And I don't know. I think it's cleaner in general. But you can feel free to read both docs. Look through both docs, and depending on your background, you might like one more than the other, and both of them will work. Brunel says, one question, why Windows and not Linux or Mac? Because I like to game. I like Steam and playing games on Steam and just having everything just work. Um, I don't have anything against Linux or Mac. Um, I'm a self-taught developer. I learned coding on the job at work. I do not have any kind of a CS background, any kind of a CS college education at all. Um, and so I learned how to code on the job, and my workplaces have always used Windows. So I learned how to code in a Windows environment. And so, because I like to game, because that's what I'm used to, I just use Windows. But if my workplace suddenly switched to Mac, I would be like, okay, whatever, I don't care. I can do that too. I think what's important in life in general is to be flexible. And so if my workplace suddenly switched, I would switch too. It's all good. Thank you, Jam Time, and thank you for the sub as well. It's all a tool. It's all a tool to get the job done, right? Yeah, exactly. And it's important. I think in general, whenever you are doing anything creative, and I consider coding to be a creative endeavor. Whenever you're doing anything creative, it's important to not get too hung up on what specific tools you're using. Don't let it prevent you from actually making stuff or building stuff. There's always going to be somebody's always going to tell you that you're using the wrong thing, or you are or that you need the next best thing in order to do, in order to create things. And I mean, you can draw just as well with a pencil and a piece of paper, or a piece of chalk on a piece of slate, as as you potentially could with a tablet and a digital pen. It's just make stuff. I don't know. Doesn't really matter in the end. Yeah, don't let one of my favorite sayings is, don't let perfect be the enemy of good, right? Just put stuff out there, and find out what works for you. I program Fuels Novel says, I program on an Atari ST. I would like to see that. Uh, Paralysis by analysis, indeed. Yeah, that's a real thing that I like to mention it because it's a real thing that befalls a lot of newer developers, and because it's such a daunting new world, right? And you're like, oh, but somebody on Twitter told me I need to have this specific library, or I need to learn this framework, or I won't be successful. um, or somebody is trying to sell me this, I don't know, specific laptop that they say is good for coding. Do I need that? Do I need that? No, you don't. I mean, you can use a online sandbox editor. um, like Mavi mentioned, that's a really excellent point. There's you don't even need you don't even need VS Code installed in your machine, right? You can learn basic stuff in the browser. Use sandbox editors, like we just saw here. You can, we haven't had to enable React this entire time because we've been using it in the docs via a cloud-based editor, right? And so there's all sorts of ways you can get the work done. Um, and so yeah, don't let perfect be the enemy of good. Just build stuff, make stuff, play around with stuff, find what works for you. Lucian says, unrelated to React, but what's your thoughts on putting projects you've learned through following along in your portfolio? Oh, okay. So I think what you're asking is, should I, if I've built something, following along with a tutorial or somebody else's stream, should I put those things in my portfolio? I would say customize it and make it your own in some way, whether it's changing, maybe you are changing it from a to-do list app to like a, like a calorie tracking app, right? Maybe you're changing you're changing what the user sees, even if the underlying logic is very similar. Customize it, make it your own, add features, change functionality, that type of thing. Do customize it to make it personal to you. And I deliberately, a lot of the projects that I do on stream, um, mostly because I suck at styling, but I build them out to be fairly bare bones in appearance. Because what I hope you do is that if you do follow along, you build out the basic foundation, the structure, the nuts and bolts of it, and then you take it and you make it beautiful and pretty, and you customize it to to be personal to you, right? You add features, you add buttons, you add tailwind and styling, um, and you make it unique to you. And so it's a truly representation of your work, right? Um, because I mean, under the hood, a lot of things are a to-do app, right? They're just it's doing CRUD operations, it's hitting a database, and it's bringing something back. But how you customize it then makes it personal. So that's my opinion there. And I do that deliberately on a lot of my projects. And a lot of times at the end of my streams, when we've built a project, I'll say something like, okay, I put this out on my GitHub for you to use. Now make it personal to you. Do something with it. Make it awesome. Mavi says, please don't use Notepad. Oh, Mavi, your head's going to explode when I tell you what folks at my at my day job use to edit code sometimes. Hint: it has the word notepad in it and ends in plus plus. And Brunel mentions that there is merit in understanding how class components work, um, more aware of controlling components and their life cycle. Nowadays, I only use functional components, but I really think that class components are important to understand what's happening behind it and understand why props exist. And that's fair. I mean, absolutely. You could always start out learning the class method and then, the logic of what's happening there. And then you could always transition to functional based components. And that's, I think, the wonderful thing is that both of these sets of documents are out there. So if you're just not, if we get in next week and we talk about props and all these important under the hood type things of how React actually works logically, and that's just not clicking with you, you could always try going back to the class based docs and reading through it there and seeing, okay, does the way they explain it here make more sense to me? So I think that's great that they have both versions available, and so you can always go back and and I've actually gone through the class-based documentation. I've gone through it here on stream. So if you go back through my YouTube history, you should be able to find where we go through those class-based docs on stream together, all the examples, everything, and so if this isn't clicking with you, you can always go back to that. Fuel Snubble says, I use Notepad all the time, but not to edit code. Oh, yeah, you can use it to edit code. I know. Yep, I have a lot of experience with that. Lil Pixel says, you don't work for the government, do you? Well, close. I work for a major university. So similar sort of, some similar practices. There's plenty of good things about it, believe me, which is why I work there. But there are some things where I'm just like, face palm. I do have VS Code installed on my work machine now, though. I use it for the most part. It's convincing other people to use it that's the hard part. Dr. Moda says, I wrote my PhD thesis in Vim with LaTeX. I don't know. I think LaTeX is pretty awesome, actually. Writing in Vim is a whole nother ballgame, but yeah, Vim is fine. A lot of folks use Vim. But just like Vim has a lot of things that people prefer about it, but just like plain old Notepad, like yeah, no. All right, any other questions? Dr. Moda says, I would rather like Mike Tyson punch me than write in Word. That's fair. Hey, whatever's the right tool for the job, right? Ty Ferris says, at least it ain't WordPad. Okay, I'm gonna break your heart, but I've got coworkers that use TextPad for not even Notepad plus plus, not even the extra functions of Notepad plus plus. I've seen people using TextPad, man. Oof, oof, indeed. Roblox, oof. I don't know, maybe I don't even know. I never heard of it before I saw people actually using it. I think it's old, yeah. But hey, that's you know, big nonprofits. That's what you get. But in the end, hey, but in the end, you know what? In the end, everybody gets their work done. So what matters is that you actually made something, right? Any other questions? Right? As long as the results are quality, who cares what tools you used? Exactly. But yeah, and just to be clear, for all of my personal projects outside of work, I exclusively use VS Code because it's so much better. And I'm trying to introduce it to my workplace as well. The adoption is slow, but continuing. Lil Pix last, when do you stream? So if you go to my Twitch channel, I should have my schedule up. I stream every Sunday at 3 p.m. Eastern, which since the time change is now 1 hour earlier, so depending on where you are in the world, you just need to pay attention to the time zones. But yeah, so we are. I stream every Sunday at 3 p.m. Eastern. I love the editor the editor back and forth in chat. Infern Gamer says, "What IDE editor does your workplace use?" We were just talking about that. So by day, I am a SQL developer. So I write PL SQL, which is Oracle SQL, which is pretty standard for enterprise type systems. And so a lot of the editing, to be fair, a lot of the editing that we do is actually done directly in PL SQL Developer, which is an environment that allows us to write and execute SQL statements against the database. So a lot of it is done directly in the developer itself. But a lot of times we also edit code. We edit code in Notepad++, which I think is hilarious. I mean, Notepad++ is great for a lot of things. It's actually what I use for my notes for streams. When you see me dictating through a finished project, and I'm like I have extra notes, those will be in Notepad++. But I write code in VS Code certainly in my personal projects. Brunel says, "Who never did a drop database on the first day of work?" Fortunately, my current workplace actually has an extremely robust um, set of development environments. So we had a new developer, we hired on a new developer, fantastic dev, by the way, they're great. But they dropped an important table that was a trigger table for a bunch of other operations. They dropped it accidentally, didn't mean to, obviously. But the good thing was it was in dev, right? That's what dev environments are for. They're for dropping tables, or royally screwing things up, and then you catch it in dev, and then you just reinstate it. You can migrate it back down from a higher environment, and everything's fine. Feels Novel says deleting a load balancer in prod is also kind of bad. Yeah. So also we have plenty. We have accounts that are we do have a read write account for prod, for like on call situations, but we also have read only accounts for prod. And so if we're just looking at something in prod, we can log in as read only and not worry about breaking stuff. So I think that we have a lot of safeguards in place, which are good. I've worked in environments before in the past that um, didn't. Yeah, I think y'all who have been longtime viewers, I'm sure, are familiar with one of my previous employers that did not have any development environments whatsoever. Everything, including bug fixes, releases, testing, everything was done in prod and in a production environment, like in a literal production environment, so a factory environment. So you've got data, flowing in and out 24/7. You've got real people relying on the outputs of this database, like building stuff, on a factory floor, and everything was in prod all the time. And I was the main like frontline operations manager for that production floor, and who howdy, that was a fun time. Every test was a screen test, right? And so it makes me so thankful that my current employer actually has proper layered, tiered development environments before you finally go to prod, multiple layers of testing, um, and controlled access to each level. So it's good. That's good practice. Yeah, Phil Snubble says, "I want as little rights as possible." Absolutely, me too. It's you should never, unless you're in an on-call situation where something is broken in prod and it has to be fixed right then and there. Nobody should have rights to prod. Talk about serious gray hair. Yeah, I don't know if y'all. It's probably kind of hard to see, but I literally have a gray streak in my hair, like down the front. It's you can't see it in the lights, but I've got like a gray streak in my hair down the front, and that gray streak started to develop when I was working for that company. And I literally, so I managed like a team of like troubleshooters, and One of them, like one of my, top like lieutenants, came up to me one day and he was like, "Is this job giving you gray hair, Miss Claire?" And and I was like, "Actually, maybe, yeah, a little bit." I think it did because I haven't really gotten more gray hair since then, so I legitimately think it did. Testing, the customer does that, right? Yeah. Yeah, Brunel says work in prod environment is crazy. Lots of antidepressants to handle the deal. OMG, so stressful. Yeah, it legitimately, like, I started having like legitimate panic attacks. Yeah, it was not a healthy work environment. Little Pixel says, "Don't worry, mine is the same way. Confirm now how I got it." And Dr. Moto says, "Can we call you Miss Glare now?" I mean, if you want. A little weird, but okay. Fuels Novel says, "One presentation I do is talking about trauma-free incident management." Oh, that's really interesting. What does that mean? Does that mean like doing proper postmortems and not like like not being constructive about blame, or like what does that mean when you say trauma-free incident management? I'm genuinely curious. Jump Over Grandma says people dye their hair to look like that. Yeah, I do. I do have like the rogue streak, like X-Men Rogue, which I actually love it. I think it's fantastic. I think it's amazing. Okay. Yeah, yeah. I would think that that would incident free. What was it called? Trauma free incident management. Yeah, like no blaming directly, more of talking about what systemic failures caused this to happen. Oh, that's rad. Okay, that's awesome, Fuel. That you have good incident management. Yeah, I would say my current workplace has good incident management. Anytime on call, anytime on call issues arise, we have a log, we discuss as a group, so we know what to do next time. Anytime something major goes wrong, we have proper postmortems. I mean, people don't get like one of my favorite things about my current team is that like if something goes wrong, it's viewed as like a systemic problem rather than any one person's fault, right? It's if somebody does something, it's more of like, okay, how did the system, like how did our current settings and configurations like even allow somebody to do that, right? If it was something bad enough to disrupt production, then it should be controlled and it shouldn't be allowed to happen. So how did that even happen and how do we stop it from happening next time? Renata says looks like Rogue from X-Men. Absolutely. That's my favorite. That's what I love. Yeah, and if you punish someone for mistakes, they just learn to hide it. Absolutely. And if somebody, a good employee will understand what they did wrong, and they will never do it again. Once you break production once, you don't want to do it again. Yep. There is no blame. The let's fix it approach. Absolutely. That's a good approach to have. Yeah, and I remember when I mentioned earlier about the somebody that dropped a table in our dev environment, and I was the first one that noticed it because I was trying to run something that was triggered off that table, and I was like, this isn't working. Like, what did I do? This should work. I don't know what I did wrong. And so I was going through it and I brought in another dev to be like, hey, can you, second pair of eyes on this for me? And so together we looked at it and we was like, yeah, I mean, I did everything right. And then we saw, oh crap, this one table that's supposed to be there is no longer there. And so we knew, what happened and who probably did it. But it didn't matter, right? Like in the end, it was like, okay, it was less like, okay, so and so did that. It was more of like, okay, how do we get this table back? Like, okay, what do we need to do to fix it? Um, and the person that did the drop was mortified. They were like, oh my god, I'm so sorry. Like, what did I do? Oh gosh, they were brand new and they just dropped this table. And but everybody was so quick to be like, no, it's okay, I'm sure you'll never, you'll obviously never do it again. um, and here's we just want you to understand exactly what happened and how we fixed it, and then we put in safeguards in place so that that could not happen again. Like nobody's going to be able to drop that table in that way ever again. So it won't be a problem going forward. And it was in dev, right? So no harm, no foul, which is the right way to handle something like that. Hey, Hassler, how's it going? Yes, we are at the end of what we talked about today, which was Intro to React, part one of a series. But yeah, we're just kind of spitballing about whatever for the last few minutes here. Hey, Alwyn, how's it going? Welcome to the stream. Alwyn says, "Hello, you always explain all tech stuff so easy. Do you have any topics which you still don't understand, even with your experience?" Abso-freaking-lutely. 100%. All the time. There is still so much that I don't understand, which is awesome. Like, that's the best. I love that there is more stuff to learn. You never want to be like at the point where you think you know everything because that's dangerous, right? There always needs to be more to learn. And I mean, there's a lot about web development in general that I don't understand. That's not my day job, right? I'm a SQL developer. I've worked on the back end for years. And so I've only done web dev for just over a year and a couple months. Um, and so, like, I'm just at the start. There's so much that I don't know. Um, but what benefits me so much is coming on here and talking about it with you all. Because the more I review it, as we know, right, how we learn is through repetition and review and reframing things. And so every time I come on here, I review the information beforehand so I know what I'm talking about. I come on here and I talk about it with you. I find myself restating things in my head, repeating things, answering questions, and then repeating things again. And so, really, this is self-learning as much as it is, helping all of you. This is this is as much for my benefit as it is for you all. So there's so much that I don't know, and that's a good thing. That's never a bad thing. There should always be more to learn and absorb, and more room to grow. If we ever run out of room to grow, then we're missing something. This field is never going to get any smaller, so there's always more to learn. No risk of learning everything, as Phil Snabel says. Absolutely. Death Knight says, "Ooh, I have a question. What methods do you use to prevent SQL injection attacks?" Yeah, so in my day job, I really don't work with customer facing SQL. So very much just on the database side, I build out ETL pipelines, which then interface with an internal reporting tool. And in that tool itself, we actually have that tool that we use, the reporting tool that we use. There's no, it doesn't allow for direct SQL queries against the tool itself. So I guess you could say the way that we prevent SQL injection into our database is having no outside, so no interfaces outside of the organization itself, so nothing that's open to the wide web. And within the internal reporting tool that we use, you cannot query directly into it. You have to use what's available to you in the GUI. So in the user interface, you have to use only the tools that you have available to you, which are read only in themselves. And we have various security tiers within the tools. We have a very robust set of security tiers which limit access to various types of data. And every single user that is authorized to log into the reporting tool is assigned a security tier, among other things. Yes, the GUI checks the input, and I know this because before I was on my current team and I had to use that tool instead of, I said before I had direct access to the database, I had to I tried to write direct SQL because I didn't want to use the GUI. I was like, I know SQL, just let me query, and it very much did not let me. There was no way I could do so. Lil Pixel says, "Is learning front end a personal project for you, or it pertains to your day job?" It does not pertain to my day job whatsoever. This has everything that I do here on stream is completely divorced from what actually makes me money, like during the day. I don't think I've been able to, other than like introducing VS Code as a tool. I don't think I've been able to use a single thing that I've learned this entire time in my day job, like ever. But that doesn't mean it's a bad thing. That doesn't mean it was wasted, right? It's still fantastic to know, and it's made me so much more well-rounded as a human being. Um, and so, no, I don't feel it's wasted or worthless or anything like that. I think it's incredibly valuable. What's my goal for learning web dev? Funsies. Maybe I'll get a job with it. Maybe I'll get a job with it eventually, or has it as a component like of of my job eventually. But funsies, because I can, because it's fun to learn and I like learning things. Yeah, I feel like if you have I'm privileged enough that I have the um, the time and the emotional the mental emotional bandwidth to pick this stuff up, right? Not everybody does. Some people have way more pressing things in their lives which prevent them from doing anything else other than doing their day job and then coming home and taking care of everything else. And I'm fortunate enough that I have the time and bandwidth to pick this sort of thing up, so I figure I have that privilege, so I should do that. That's why you need to make cutescats.com. There you go, personal project. Death Knight, they're sharing a few resources, OWASP, for dealing with potential security risks. Thank you for sharing that. And thank you for the follow there. I'm not going to read your name. Hassler asks, "Are we still going to have the part two of SQL, or are you not sure?" Yes, I would actually love to. Um, Leon is doing some major revisions to the Discord this weekend, today, I think, actually. And there's going to be some changes to like the stream team part of the Discord. So I'll see what those are. I want to bring my sequel part two to as wide of an audience as I can. Um, and so I hope that the revisions to the Discord will help with that a little bit, reaching the widest pool of people that I can. And so I do still want to do that part too. Yeah, you can definitely do your negotiations offline. Absolutely. All right. Oh my goodness. Wow. I I'm very good at talking about random stuff after I finish with the actual things I set up the stream to talk about. But I'm happy to keep going. But oh wow, Death Knight said, I saw a post on Facebook. Uh, the guy was authenticating the user on his front end. His back end was sending the entire database of user info to the front end to handle that logic. Yeah, don't do that. Thanks, I hate it. Absolutely. Yeah, and so that's when something like GraphQL could be your friend as well if you're struggling with. I mean, you should, gosh dang, if you're doing your queries properly, if you're doing actual good queries, you should be able to pull exactly from the database what you need and only that. And and handling that logic in your controllers on your server is where you want to do that, and never sending it to the client if you can avoid it. Oh my goodness. Do you have a lot of database trigger dependencies in your work stuff? If so, how do you document that to share knowledge between people? Yeah, so we work primarily with ETL pipelines, which are triggered. We have so we use like a scheduler to trigger these. use to trigger these informatical workflows to fire off at specific times and specific sequences. And so, we don't use a lot of like hard coded direct SQL triggers. I mean, it's mostly um, done within Informatica. But as far as how we share documentation, we do a lot of group walkthroughs of things. Anytime somebody comes up with anytime somebody finishes a new mapping, we do a group walkthrough with the entire team. And anything like special that we discover or critical logic wise that we discover gets put into our central documentation storage. So anybody can search for it and find it and read about it. One of the things that we've done quite a bit in the past couple of years is really try to double down on documentation. I just think it's important to do so. So we have basically a documentation storage that everybody has access to. Anybody can search. Anybody on our team anyway that has access to, and anybody can search for specific logic or documentation. Yeah. No worries. Yeah. And so the team that I'm on currently, it used to be only like 3 people. And now it's up to, what are we at, like 7 or 8? And so as you get a larger team, you really need to have good documentation because you can't just go and be like, oh, well, Larry didn't write that, so Susie must have written that. And I can just ask Susie what this means. And that's not, when you got 8 people on your team, that's not going to work anymore. So you have to have just clear documentation, spelling out logic, without having to go back to that person every single time. Time it takes to complete task, 10 minutes. Time it takes to write the commit message, 30 minutes. Yeah. Yeah, as Death Knight mentioned, be careful with your, yeah, be careful how you're getting data out of your databases, folks. Never send it all the way to the front end. All right. Any last thoughts before we wrap up here? Otherwise, we'll start looking up somebody to raid. Also, use different password for everything. Yeah, do that. That's one of the best things that you can do. Dr. Moda says, I'm saving up to name a kitty. Absolutely. One of my channel, for those of you who don't know, one of my channel points rewards is naming a foster kitten. I already have 2 names on deck, one from Madeline and one from Drunk Uncle Grandma. So next time I get a litter of foster kittens, those are 2 are claimed, but I'm sure there will be others up for grabs, for you to name whatever you like, as long as it's appropriate, safe for work. Dr. Moda says, would you name one Dingus? I think so. I could check with the shelter and make sure that that would be like, I use that word a lot, but I might have to check with the shelter and make sure that's kosher. But if they say yeah, then sure. Mavi says, "What's the laziest thing I can use for docs?" Like, you mean as far as like writing your own documentation? And I mean, do you want it to be like online, or like who do you want to be able to see these docs? I guess that's the main question. Do you want to be? Is it personal or for consumption by others? Okay, I'm not sure what you said yes to. Help me out. I love how like my one of my favorite things about these streams is that like I don't lose viewers at the end when I'm just like spewing like 30 minutes of random junk. Y'all stick around for the random crap that happens at the end of streams. It's great. Okay, so I mean, assuming you want it to be accessible to others, um, thanks, Scotty. Assuming that you want it to be, I mean, you could always like do a wiki or something. Um, yeah, you could use GitHub Pages. Yeah, um, and then you could have Chat GPT help you generate it. Yeah, ChatGPT is pretty good at spitting out docs. Dr. Moto says R has a package that converts your comments before functions to documentation. Is there something like that for JS? I'm sure there is. There's got to be. Fuel Snow says, I wrote a job ad with ChatGPT. Oh yeah, I wrote a complaint letter with ChatGPT because I hate writing complaint letters. It did a great job. Just the right level of concealed anger and snarkiness. It was great. Yeah, blog posts. I mean, yeah, I'm afraid the job of the content writer, the content farm contributor, has is numbered at this point. All right, let's find somebody to raid. ChatGPT gets stuff wrong a lot, though. Yeah, but I don't think it all. I think it will get better. I think it will improve. That's the exciting part. Koski mentions JS doc. Okay, thank you for that, Koski. All right, so any suggestions on who we might want to raid? JC says, shout out to you for coding this long. Oh, do you mean on stream today? Oh, thank you. These are actually short streams. I used to really punish myself and do like, 6, 7, 8 hour streams, which was not healthy. So I forced myself to stop that in the interest of my own well being. But I appreciate it. Thank you. JC says, I wish I could code for that long consistently. Well, honestly, what helps is being on stream, having chat there, and having having an audience is nice. Even if you're not, maybe you're not on Twitch, maybe you go on Discord with some friends and you work on a project together. I think you'll find that time goes a lot faster. It doesn't have to be live on Twitch, but it could be just with some friends. Yeah, accountability and breaks, and we also take breaks. That's right. Yep. It's important to be kind to yourself, whatever you do. All right. Any suggestions on somebody we might want to rate? We've only got a couple folks who are online today. Looks like who are on my list anyway. We've got Dion and Team Vash. So I'm open to suggestions, preferably within the software and game dev ecosystem, to kind of share the love around that community. But if there's no suggestions, we can do either Team Vash or Dion Saga. Freedom said, can you rate someone with one viewer? Yeah, we can. Do you have a suggestion? Oh, we got Girl with Box as well. Oh, they do React? Okay. Let's look them up. All right. Yeah, if they're doing React, then that sounds like a good person to see what they are up to. So if you want to see, hopefully they're building a project, and maybe y'all can see, how React is used in an actual project. And we've done some of those on stream, but I'm obviously no pro with React. So if they are a pro with React, then they're probably a great person to watch. You funny, Mommy. All right. I'm going to go ahead and set up the raid. It was a pleasure hanging out with you all today. And I will see you all next Sunday for more React. We're going to keep going through the docs until we finish them. So expect more React. We're going to talk about props. We're going to talk about state. We're going to talk about all the real nuts and bolts and the meat of how React actually works to pass things down from to move logic around between components. And I think that's the coolest part. So yeah, next week, like, yes, exactly. Like Lil said, next week is where the fun begins. To quote a Star Wars meme, this is where the fun begins, is next Sunday, where we get into the real nuts and bolts of it. So I look forward to seeing you all back next week. Bring your friends. If you know, if anybody else wants to learn React, have them stop in next week, and we're gonna have a great time. All right, we're starting the raid. All right, rating now. See you all next week.